Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we drift through velvet drapes and candlelit chambers into a shadowed tale of power, decadence, and decay. The story you're about to hear traces the ripple of a single disease through centuries of kings, queens, and noble bloodlines. It begins with whispers and weeping legions and ends with empires quietly crumbling. Along the way, madness, mystery, and medical treatments that'll make your skin crawl. One gentle warning: they probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me, where in the world are you listening from tonight, and what time is it by your clock? Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It all begins not with a royal, but with a war. Specifically the French invasion of Naples in 1494. Charles VIII, the young King of France, brings with him thousands of soldiers, a vast supply train, and dreams of Roman glory. What he doesn't know, what no one knows yet, is that his campaign will ignite the first pandemic of syphilis in European history. The disease emerges suddenly, brutally, and spreads like a brush fire. Soldiers complain of swollen genitals, ulcerated mouths, and rotting flesh. Some go blind within weeks, many die. Historians still argue whether this was a new mutation brought back from the Americas. Some call it the Columbian theory, or simply a long-simmering European infection that chose this moment to erupt. Either way, by the time Charles limps home, his army decimated not by Neapolitans but by disease, syphilis is on the move, and royalty, as always, is in the front row for the catastrophe. The thing about syphilis is that it plays the long game. It doesn't always strike immediately. First, the sores, then a lull. Months or even years pass and it returns, this time attacking the nervous system, the brain, the bones. A person may live for decades with the disease gnawing silently from within. In courtly circles where sexual discretion is more theoretical than actual, it spreads efficiently. Think of it as the original royal influencer, passed from bed to bed, palace to palace, until it wears a crown of its own. Soon everyone's whispering. Physicians call it the Great Pox, to distinguish it from smallpox. Pamphlets depict monstrous genitalia and demonic boils. Treatments range from the mildly useless to the outright horrifying. Mercury becomes the standard, a silver liquid applied to the skin, or, worse, inhaled or injected. A night in the arms of Venus, they say, leads to a lifetime on Mercury. Nice slogan. Terrible prognosis. Amid all this, European monarchs begin to shift. Not publicly, of course. No king wants to be known as his royal contagion. But behind the tapestries, patterns emerge. Marriages become colder, alliances more fraught. Courtiers die young. Heirs vanish from portraits between one year and the next. Chronic pain, mood swings, paranoia, these start to look suspiciously familiar. The disease leaves its fingerprints everywhere, but never signs its name. In Renaissance portraits, faces remain serene, but artists start avoiding hands. Why? Because syphilitic ulcers deform the fingers. In letters between diplomats, oblique references to the affliction or the inherited malaise dot the margins. Royal mistresses fall mysteriously ill. Princes once hailed as brilliant become erratic, then vanish into monasteries or country retreats. The term madness becomes elastic enough to cover anything inconvenient. And still, the parties continue. Take a moment now to picture a court ball in the early 1500s. The silk, the powdered wigs, the music of lutes drifting like perfume through candle smoke. Somewhere near the throne, a nobleman leans closer to whisper in a duchess's ear. His breath is sour, his lips cracked. But she smiles anyway. After all, he's second cousin to the king. They disappear behind a velvet curtain. A week later, she has a rash. By spring, she's replaced in court gossip with another name, another scandal. The cycle continues. One mainstream historical estimate suggests that by 1500, a third of Europe's population may have been infected. And among the infected, clergy, artists, and yes, plenty of kings. Some historians speculate even Martin Luther may have suffered from it, though that debate remains unresolved. But royalty bears a unique burden. When a commoner suffers, the world shrugs. When a king stumbles, history writes poetry, and syphilis is a master poet. consider how the disease infiltrates not just the flesh, but the mind. Neurosyphilis, the final stage, can mimic schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and even messiah complexes. Monarchs affected by it don't just suffer, they unravel in front of their courts. Their proclamations grow erratic, their punishments more brutal. Love turns to suspicion, and children become threats. Imagine trying to rule a kingdom while your own brain slowly turns against you. One fringe theory suggests that the sudden shifts in court etiquette, the rise of elaborate clothing, heavy perfumes and obsessive hand-washing, were all unconscious responses to syphilis. The disease didn't just kill, it rewired culture. Romance became dangerous, touch became taboo, even literature reflected the dread. Shakespeare's references to the infinite variety of disease aren't just poetic, they're specific. Historians still argue whether Elizabeth I ever contracted it, perhaps via a lover or suitor. The evidence is thin but tantalising. Her famously pale, powder-caked face, a possible nod to pockmarks or lesions. Her temper, famously mercurial, possibly something more than stress. But no definitive record confirms it. Just another royal ghost story. By the 1600s, syphilis has become as much a symbol as a sickness. Satirical prints show kings with bloated noses and ulcerated legs. Medical texts grow stranger, describing nocturnal bones singing and serpentine fire in the limbs. One royal doctor prescribes a paste made from mummified flesh mixed with honey and saffron. Another recommends bathing in wine, followed by bleeding from the temples. Spoiler, neither works. The curse of syphilis, of course, isn't just medical, it's dynastic. A single infected prince can doom a lineage. He marries, passes the disease to his wife. She miscarries. The heir is born with congenital syphilis, blind, deformed, or dead by age 5. Behind every royal portrait of smiling toddlers, there's often a graveyard of failed pregnancies and tiny coffins. Even worse, the silence. Royal families bury their sick. They rewrite timelines. A mad son becomes a melancholy scholar. A vanished daughter becomes devoted to God. Entire generations disappear under euphemisms, and still the disease travels. By the 1700s, it's global. European royals, intermarried like vines in a dying orchard, spread it from Versailles to Vienna, from Moscow to Madrid. The Habsburgs, always genetically fragile, appear to suffer more than most. One cousin limps, another loses his teeth by age 30, a third lives alone, obsessively drawing pictures of angels with bleeding mouths. Whether it's all syphilis, no one can say, but the pattern grows impossible to ignore. And here's the kicker. Syphilis, unlike other plagues, doesn't need poverty. It thrives in wealth. It prefers silk sheets and private chambers, doesn't care about virtue or villainy, it just wants proximity. And kings, surrounded by lovers, servants and secrets, offer it the perfect kingdom. By the end of this section, let's return to Charles VIII, the boy king who lit the match. He dies young, barely 27 after hitting his head on a doorframe. Not syphilis, technically, but many believe he'd been suffering from it already. His symptoms, chronic pain, erratic mood, and skin lesions. Fitting, isn't it? The king who brought the curse home felled not by battle or betrayal, but by something as banal as a poorly placed lintel. History, like syphilis, has a dark sense of humour. Charles VIII might be the first to unwittingly carry the seed of Europe's syphilitic scourge, but he is hardly the last to suffer its creeping torment. As the disease burrows its way into the bloodstream of European courts, it does not discriminate by age, empire, or ambition. And now, standing beneath the golden ceilings of his palatial halls, another monarch prepares to leave his mark, both on history and possibly on the disease's timeline. Young, ambitious, and eager to expand his realm, he is France's star on the rise. But like many stars, he will burn fast, and what he carries may burn even longer. Charles VIII's Italian campaign ends not only in failure, but in mutation. The syphilis strain believed to have returned with his men is more virulent than its old-world ancestors. Faster acting, more brutal. In Naples, soldiers describe pustules the size of acorns and faces that melt like wax. Within 5 years of Charles's retreat, syphilis is epidemic in every major city from Lisbon to Krakow. Brothels close, physicians panic. Yet among Europe's elite, it becomes the infection no one talks about, and yet everyone fears. As the plague roams freely through bedchambers and boudoirs, it finds its way into royal veins with disturbing regularity. Charles himself, likely infected before his death in 1498, shows telltale signs during his final year. His hair thins, his skin bruises easily, his temper flares and subsides like a faulty candle. But the diagnosis never appears in his official record. Instead, they describe fatigue, melancholy, and a vague blood imbalance. Euphemism becomes a palace tradition. It's important to understand how monarchy itself accelerates the spread. Kings and queens are not just symbols, they are marriage brokers, alliance makers, and reproduction machines. Every union has a purpose, every child a political role. When one member of this glittering genetic chain becomes infected, the repercussions span continents. In the case of Charles, it is his childless death that causes the most immediate chaos. He leaves no heir. His cousin Louis XII takes the throne, and with Louis comes a new chapter in both politics and disease. Louis XII, older and wiser, or at least wearier than Charles, attempts to stabilise France, but he inherits more than a crown. If Charles truly had syphilis, and if any part of the royal household was infected, it would now lie dormant in the inner circle, and in the 16th century, dormant doesn't mean safe, it means ticking. One fringe theory posits that the French court's sudden obsession with spiritual purity and reform was an unconscious reaction to the disease's guilt-ridden symptoms. Night sweats, hallucinations, confessions poured to priests in the dead of night. All these fed a growing culture of fear and penitence. Court astrologers were consulted more than doctors. Mercury treatments became acts of desperation. The smell of burnt cinnabar and quicksilver lingered in dressing rooms long after their occupants had passed out. Amid this surreal backdrop, the young Henry VIII of England begins his rise. Tall, athletic, and blessed with that lethal combination of charisma and unchecked power, Henry is the very image of Renaissance royalty. But beneath the polished armour and swelling choirs lies something else. His father, Henry VII, had secured the throne after decades of civil war. The Tudor line is fragile. Every royal birth therefore becomes a national event, every miscarriage a national crisis. And oh, how many crises there are. Henry VIII marries 6 times in his desperate quest for a male heir, but few pause to ask why so many of his wives suffer tragic pregnancies, why so many infants arrive stillborn or sickly. One mainstream theory blames a blood incompatibility, another suggests a genetic disorder, but buried beneath those pages lies another hypothesis, whispered, fringe, but chilling. What if Henry himself had syphilis? Supporters of this theory point to his later symptoms. He grows obese, sure, but also paranoid. He suffers violent leg ulcers that never heal, described in court letters as oozing with foulness. His temperament swings wildly, from joyous to tyrannical. Historians still argue whether this is simple megalomania or something more pathological. One historian calls him a man slowly unravelling by degrees. Another simply notes that his court doctors kept vials of mercury close at hand. The Tudor court, meanwhile, grows increasingly tense. Anne Boleyn's downfall is often attributed to her failure to produce a male heir. But some letters hint at darker suspicions, rumours that the Queen suffered a sickness of the womb. Her daughter Elizabeth survives but grows up strangely aloof. Her skin, it is said, required thick layers of white lead to maintain its famous pallor. Coincidence? Or the echo of her father's affliction? At the same time, in Eastern Europe, another ruler ascends who will make Henry look like a choir boy. Ivan IV of Russia, known to us as Ivan the Terrible, seizes power with fire in his veins and visions in his sleep. His childhood is steeped in trauma, his adulthood in violence, and yet it's the nature of his madness that draws speculation. In his later years, Ivan becomes paranoid to the point of absurdity. He accuses walls of spying on him. He dresses in peasant rags and howls at the moon. He beats his pregnant daughter-in-law for wearing revealing clothing, and when his son protests, Ivan kills him with a blow to the head. Historians debate the source of his psychosis. Some blame childhood trauma, others mercury poisoning. But a third camp whispers of syphilis. It was already present in Moscow during his reign. His erratic behaviour fits, and one gruesome account describes his body, after death, as being riddled with open sores. Of course, Russian chronicles are hardly known for clinical accuracy, but when patterns start repeating across nations, one starts to wonder. Back in Spain, another prince begins to crumble. Don Carlos, heir to Philip II, is a textbook case of noble descent into madness. Described in early life as awkward but promising, he soon descends into self-harm, paranoia, and violent outbursts. He tries to drown a servant. He falls downstairs under mysterious circumstances. He starves himself for days, then gorges on meat and wine. Eventually his father locks him away, citing concerns for national security. Carlos dies at 23, alone, blind, and raving. Official records state fever. Unofficial ones suggest suicide. But letters between Philip's courtiers hint at something darker. Lesions, hallucinations, visions of women with melting faces. Syphilis, possibly. His grandfather, Charles V, was known for his liaisons and long military campaigns, both excellent delivery systems for the disease. One quirky tidbit. Don Carlos reportedly kept a collection of dead birds under his bed. When asked why, he claimed they sang better after death. Whether poetic or delusional, it paints a grim picture of the royal psyche unravelling. Meanwhile, across the water, the Valois court in France dances onward. Catherine de' Medici, the Queen Mother, holds the strings behind the scenes. Known for her love of astrology and poisons, Catherine also commands a court riddled with secrets. Her sons, Francis II, Charles IX, and Henry III, each display strange maladies, including rashes, convulsions, and mysterious fainting spells. The official diagnoses range from epilepsy to stress, but Catherine herself reportedly imports Venetian physicians known for their syphilis treatments. Coincidence, or a cover? A court memoir describes a hidden room in the Louvre where herbs of mercury and viper oil were prepared nightly. Some believe this was for poisons, others believe it was a syphilis clinic, royal hush-hush edition. Catherine's enemies claim she deliberately spread disease among rivals. Whether that's slander or truth, we'll never know. But the disease? It spreads regardless. By the 17th century, syphilis becomes a silent co-conspirator in palace intrigue. It rarely kills immediately. Instead, it saps vitality, clouds judgment, and sabotages succession. Monarchs who once rode horses into battle now shuffle down corridors in slippers, their joints swollen, their minds haunted by invisible fires. One final fringe fact before we pause. The expression royal blue blood may owe part of its mythology to syphilitic nobles. In mercury treatment, the skin often develops a blue-grey pallor. Combine that with the already pale faces of inbred aristocracy, and the myth takes shape. Nobility, in other words, literally looked blue, and no one dared ask why. Henry VIII's rotund figure may dominate the popular image of infected royalty, but syphilis didn't stop at his deathbed. In fact, the disease seems to sharpen its claws as it seeps across time and borders. By the time Ivan the Terrible is deep in his spasms of suspicion and rage, Europe has become a chessboard of twitching kings, hidden fevers, and whispered curses. Now the gaze turns east once again, this time to a land cloaked in snow and legend. Russia's Tsardom, always a bit out of sync with Western trends, proves no less vulnerable to the creeping poison. Ivan IV, crowned as Russia's first Tsar in 1547, begins his reign with dreams of greatness. He reforms governance, expands his empire, and builds St. Basil's Cathedral. But the brightness dims quickly. Personal tragedies, his wife's sudden death, the deaths of his children, pile onto him like frost on a windowpane. His health declines, both physically and mentally. He suffers fits of rage, migraines that last days, and long stretches of melancholia. His skin peels, his gums bleed. He accuses his own advisers of betrayal, and murders nobles in purges that make the snow run red. Historians still debate the cause of his descent. Was it mercury exposure, childhood trauma, lead poisoning from poor plumbing, or something more insidious, something like syphilis worming through his brain and bones, feeding his nightmares with grotesque clarity? One early Russian account, kept by a Polish prisoner, describes Ivan's final years as marked by boils that burst like stars and a breath that made dogs howl. Not the kind of scent you bottle for royal cologne. Even stranger is Ivan's habit of retreating into monasteries for weeks, only to emerge with new laws and a list of executions. These religious fasts, some suggest, were not penance but pain management, desperate attempts to cleanse a body under siege. He dies slumped over a chessboard, mid-game, against a visiting noble. His face reportedly frozen in a sneer, eyes wide open. Was it rage? Was it pain? Or was it the final spasm of a decades-long disease tightening its grip? Half a continent away, another royal prison swells with grief and confusion. This time it is not a king, but a prince. Don Carlos, heir to Philip II of Spain, remains one of the most enigmatic figures of the Spanish Golden Age. Descriptions of him are contradictory. Brilliant yet erratic, charming yet cruel. At 12, he suffers a traumatic head injury after falling downstairs. A fall many believe wasn't accidental. From that moment his mental state deteriorates steadily. He mutilates animals. He beats servants. He attempts to stab a guard. And yet, at court, he is treated with heartbreaking delicacy. No one wants to confront the reality that Spain's precious heir is broken, both in mind and perhaps in body. Some blame epilepsy. Others point to inherited madness from the deeply inbred Habsburg bloodline. But a persistent theory haunts the margins, that Don Carlos was born with congenital syphilis. His mother, Maria of Portugal, dies shortly after childbirth, sparking rumours that she too was infected. Her marriage to Philip II had been arranged quickly. Some whisper that Philip, the pious and aloof king, may have brought more than royal favour to the bedchamber. By the time Don Carlos is a teenager, he exhibits classic symptoms: extreme mood swings, skin conditions, insomnia, violent hallucinations. He believes the walls are spying on him. He believes angels speak through rats. Philip eventually orders his son confined, not punished, just locked away in silence, in a suite of rooms kept in perpetual twilight. No visitors, no fresh air, just the slow echo of footsteps and a table full of untouched food. Don Carlos dies at 23, his body reportedly emaciated, teeth missing, covered in sores. The official cause? Natural causes. Naturally, no one believes it. Meanwhile, in another shadowed corridor of the Spanish court, a woman begins to pace. Joanna of Castile, forever remembered as Juana la Loca, wanders the palace in grief. She has lost her beloved husband, Philip the Handsome. Her sorrow is so profound it becomes legend. She reportedly sleeps beside his corpse, keeps his coffin open, and travels across Spain with his body in tow. But behind the tragic image of the mad queen lies a more complex story. Joanna's erratic behaviour begins years before Philip's death. She swings between melancholy and euphoria. She accuses courtiers of witchcraft. She tears at her own hair. Some modern scholars argue she was suffering from bipolar disorder or schizophrenia. But another thread suggests a darker undercurrent, that her symptoms aligned with neurosyphilis. Her husband Philip had been famously promiscuous. Court documents note his many mistresses, some of whom died young and painfully. It's not unreasonable to imagine that he may have transmitted something more enduring than his royal charm. If Joanna contracted syphilis from Philip, it would explain not only her mental decline but also her gynecological complaints recorded by physicians: painful menstruation, rashes, and recurrent fevers. Her children, including Charles V and Ferdinand I, were both healthy, perhaps too early to be affected, but the seeds had been planted. And speaking of Charles V, it's worth noting that his reign, though magnificent in scope, was dogged by physical suffering. He suffered from gout, jaw problems, and chronic fatigue. He retired early to a monastery, an unusual move for a man of his ambition. Whether it was guilt, illness, or both, historians continue to puzzle over his final years. One fringe theory claims he too bore signs of late-stage syphilis, masked by layers of divine justification and religious withdrawal. Now, pivot northward to Scotland, where a very different kind of king dabbles in alchemy and medicine. James IV, unlike his more violent continental cousins, is a man of science, or at least Renaissance science. He funds medical schools, studies surgical texts, and even volunteers for experiments. One bizarre record claims he paid mute children to grow up alone on an island just to see what language they would speak spontaneously. Spoiler, it didn't work. James is also rumoured to have contracted syphilis during his youth, likely from one of his many mistresses. Unlike others, he does not deny it. He becomes obsessed with treatments, favouring herbal baths, bloodletting, and mercury rubs. He funds alchemical labs in the hope of turning disease into gold, or at least into health. One of his physicians, a Flemish doctor, writes extensively about the king's nightly fevers and cracked skin. Despite his best efforts, James dies at the Battle of Flodden in 1513, his body unrecognisable among the dead. Whether syphilis had already begun to consume him, or whether his legacy was cut short before it fully bloomed, we'll never know. But the disease's shadow trails his memory like a second funeral. Over in England, the aftermath of Henry VIII's rule continues to echo. His children, Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I, inherit not just a throne, but possibly a lingering genetic risk. Edward dies young, Mary suffers phantom pregnancies, and Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, surrounds herself with mirrors and powders, but never with heirs. Was it personal choice, political savvy, or a deep-seated fear of what she might pass on? The disease, if indeed threaded through the Tudor line, may have found its final English stop in her, and perhaps that was merciful. Let's drift back south now to Denmark, where a young king named Christian VII sits in a room full of candlelight and dread. Crowned in 1766, Christian is charming but fragile. From the start, he exhibits nervous tics and wild energy. He laughs inappropriately, refuses to sleep, and compulsively washes his hands, far ahead of his time on that last count. Doctors diagnose him with melancholy, erotic mania, and royal fragility. But modern scholars have pointed to something more concrete: syphilis, possibly contracted during his teenage escapades in Paris. One court account claims he visited no fewer than 14 brothels in a single fortnight, which, while impressive, might explain the consequences. Shortly after his return, his mental state begins to unravel. His court, unsure of what to do, installs a physician named Johann Struensee as both doctor and puppet master. Struensee essentially rules Denmark through Christian, introducing Enlightenment reforms and seducing the Queen along the way. It's a royal soap opera, but at the centre of it all stands Christian, twitching, sweating, and muttering to invisible adversaries. Eventually, Struensee is executed, the Queen is exiled, and Christian is left alone in his palace. He dies at 59, almost unrecognisable, remembered more for the power vacuum he created than any deeds of his own. His mind had left him decades earlier. What ties these figures together isn't just the possibility of infection, but the way their illnesses sculpt history. Without Don Carlos, Philip II's line weakens. Without a sane Ivan IV, Russia descends into civil strife. Without stable Tudor heirs, England's crown flirts with foreign influence, and behind all these dominoes stands a pale, poxed puppet master. By now, syphilis is no longer a newcomer to Europe. It is a veteran disease, adapting, hiding, morphing with the times. It finds new hosts in new palaces, leaves old ones buried in silence. It will appear again and again in this tale, whispering through generations. The Spanish sun continues to burn bright across the Iberian Peninsula, but inside the stone walls of royal palaces shadows lengthen. Syphilis, now a constant yet invisible companion of European nobility, evolves not just as a disease, but as an architectural presence. Secret wings in castles, private sick rooms, long curtained hallways with no windows and no mirrors. And as the disease advances, so too does the behaviour of those who fear and hide it. Don Carlos may have been the loudest royal warning siren, but others follow in eerie harmony. And nowhere is that chorus more heartbreakingly discordant than in the lives of those born into greatness, only to collapse before they can wield it. The House of Habsburg, so proud in its golden lineage, becomes a case study in unravelling, and within this imperial dynasty, syphilis plays its most subtle hand. Let's peer into the late 17th century, where Pedro II of Portugal sits, contemplative and quiet. Known as the Pacific for his calm demeanour, Pedro's reign is one of tentative progress, of regaining lost ground, both politically and literally. But his court whispers of something more intimate, more disconcerting. His son, João, is born sickly, his daughter dies young, and the king himself ages oddly, fast in some ways, painfully slow in others. Court letters reference constant ailments of the mouth and tenderness in the joints. A Portuguese physician describes the king's aversion to bright light and his increasingly withdrawn behaviour. Pedro's affection for his second wife, Maria Sophia of Neuburg, is genuine, but their union yields more sorrow than joy. Of their children, many do not survive infancy. The surviving heir, Jerome V, later earns the nickname the Magnanimous, but behind the curtain of his court, Mercury once again finds its place in the royal apothecary. Pedro's personal letters, kept mostly out of the public eye, reveal a man obsessed with cleanliness, terrified of sin, and increasingly suspicious of those closest to him. The ink scrawls become messier over time. He writes of a fire behind the eyes, of flesh that betrays itself. Whether poetic lament or physical reality, the signs point in a direction hard to ignore. Syphilis has claimed subtler victims before. Now we drift further into this velvet-clad network of suffering to meet a man whose writings, love letters, and political influence suggest brilliance, yet whose physical decay tells another story. Pedro I of Brazil and IV of Portugal, the same man split between continents, is known for his sweeping independence movements and liberal reforms, but his personal life is riddled with contradiction. He's a romantic and a libertine, a patriot and a womanizer. And according to court documents and diary entries, he suffers from a mysterious long-term illness that ravages his body. By his mid-30s, Pedro's health nosedives. He complains of chronic headaches, memory loss, and shooting pains in his legs. His libido, once the talk of both Lisbon and Rio, vanishes overnight. One court physician notes unusual pupil reactions, a common symptom in neurosyphilis. Another writes of a hollowing beneath the cheeks, unnatural for a man of such youth. Pedro's letters to his mistress, Domitila, grow erratic and dreamy. He asks her to pray with him, then to flee with him, then not to write at all. The contradictions pile up, each like a loose brick in a collapsing archway. Historians still argue whether his premature death at age 35 was due to tuberculosis, stress, or something more insidious. But his last autopsy, performed in secret, mentions lesions in the brain and spinal inflammation. Not diagnostic, but certainly suspicious. If Pedro is a man torn between two thrones, then his European counterpart, George III of Britain, is a man torn between two minds. Aha, George III. To modern ears, he's the mad king who lost America. But the truth, like all things touched by syphilis, is more nuanced. His reign spans decades, and during his early years, he is thoughtful, intelligent, even reform-minded. He's a loving father and a devout Protestant. But around 1788 something changes. The king begins to talk incessantly, often for hours without pause. He forgets names, places, even basic facts about his own government. He insists on touching every tree in Windsor Forest. He writes long letters to people who've died. His urine turns blue, a side effect of a medicine known as gentian, but enough to make palace rumours catch fire. His court panics, Parliament trembles, and George, he becomes a myth in his own lifetime. Now, historians largely attribute his condition to porphyria, a rare genetic disorder that affects the nervous system. And yes, porphyria fits many of the symptoms: abdominal pain, hallucinations, mood swings. But a fringe group of medical historians believes otherwise. They point to the king's erratic behaviour, his progressive decline, and reports of sores and tremors as signs not of porphyria, but of late-stage syphilis. His doctors used mercury. Again. They employed bleeding, purging, even induced vomiting, yet George only worsens. George, his ability to govern fades. His son, the future George IV, becomes Prince Regent. And behind the scenes, royal correspondence begins to omit more than it reveals. One particularly disturbing letter refers to the king's moments of dreadful clarity, interrupted by screams. By the time George dies in 1820, he is blind, deaf, and utterly removed from reality. Whether the cause is syphilis or genetic misfortune, the result is the same: a nation adrift, steered by whispers and hope. Let's shift now to Denmark again, where the echoes of madness ripple further through the quiet reign of Christian VII. We've met him briefly before, but now we turn the lens fully onto this fragile, haunted king. Christian VII ascends the Danish throne at the tender age of 17. From the outset, he's unusual, brilliant one moment, disturbingly absent the next. He reads Voltaire but cannot finish a sentence. He dances through banquets, then curls into himself like a dying animal. His physicians, perplexed, diagnose everything from melancholic terror to overuse of private passions, a particularly genteel way of saying that Christian had a compulsive relationship with self-pleasure. It's as awkward in 1700s Denmark as it would be now. His court brings in Johann Struensee, a German doctor whose Enlightenment ideals clash with the shadowy world of a royal dysfunction. For a time, things improve. Struensee calms the king's outbursts. He helps him bathe, dress, even speak in public. But the doctor also begins to wield political power, issuing edicts in the king's name, reforming labour laws, banning torture, and eventually falling in love with Queen Caroline Matilda. The triangle collapses with devastating speed. Struensee is arrested, tortured, and executed. The Queen is exiled. And Christian? He retreats into his mind, from which he never truly returns. In his final decades, Christian lives like a ghost. His meals are delivered through a slot. His room is soundproofed. Attendants rotate to prevent emotional attachment. He sits for hours, scratching symbols into his wooden floor, convinced they will open a door to somewhere better. Though no doctor diagnoses him with syphilis outright, his symptoms bear haunting resemblance to others we've met. Paranoia, tremors, emotional vacillation, severe depression. The Danish court, ever polite, simply calls it the King's Private Storms. Now we drift west again to France, where the legacy of the Sun King casts long shadows, especially over his descendants. Louis XIV lives long and splendidly, but his grandsons are not so lucky. Louis, Duke of Burgundy, Louis, Duke of Brittany, and finally, Louis XV, each one stepping closer to the throne and each more frail than the last. Louis XV, nicknamed the Beloved, is anything but in his later years. Though crowned young and full of promise, he grows reclusive, bitter, and obsessed with sexual escapades. He constructs the Parc aux Cerfs, a private harem of young girls hidden near Versailles. Though disturbing by any standard, what truly marks his decline is the spread of disease among his consorts. Reports describe girls developing rashes, being dismissed without explanation, and court physicians quietly ordering mercury baths. One mistress, Jeanne du Barry, famously wears gloves long after they go out of fashion. Rumours swirl that her hands are deformed. And Louis himself, he complains of bones that won't rest and a burning in the belly. He dies not of syphilis officially, but smallpox. Yet the resemblance is uncanny. Some historians argue he may have suffered both. One quirky tidbit here. French perfumers during Louis XV's reign begin crafting scents specifically designed to mask the odour of syphilitic sores. One blend, Eau d'Argent, is rumoured to have been formulated for the king's chambers, its floral base concealing the acrid sting of mercury and decay. By the time Louis XVI is crowned, the disease has faded from public view but not from royal blood. He and Marie Antoinette may not have shown symptoms, but they inherit a court soaked in whispers and secrets. The revolution soon washes it all away, cleansing the throne with something far sharper than perfume, the blade of the guillotine, and yet syphilis endures, not in names or coronations, but in shadows and lineage. Its fingerprints are everywhere, in aborted heirs, mysterious deaths, and sudden bouts of madness written off with delicate phrases and strong wine. The disease becomes a spectre of its own court, unseen, but always seated at the table. As revolution and reform sweep across Europe, the crowns once so confidently anchored atop royal heads begin to wobble. Palaces are stormed, heads roll, some quite literally, and the divine right of kings crumbles like sugar left out in the rain. Yet even as new republics rise from the ashes of old empires, an older, quieter adversary continues to hum beneath the velvet, corseted elegance of monarchies. Syphilis, still unspoken, still powerful. It adapts to every shift in the political landscape. It cares not for revolution, only proximity. By now, in the 18th and 19th centuries, syphilis is no longer whispered solely behind brocade drapes and ornate confessionals. It's a public menace, painted in caricature, discussed in salons and studied in medical journals. But within the still-standing palaces of old Europe, it remains something else, a dynastic time bomb. The next chamber door we open leads us to a prince so plagued by sickness, suspicion and sadness that his story has become almost Shakespearean in its melancholy. He is Prince Leopold of Habsburg-Lorraine, Grand Duke of Tuscany and future Holy Roman Emperor, known to history as Leopold I. His reign is long and largely competent, but his family tree is tangled in more than just political alliances. By the 1600s and 1700s, the Habsburg dynasty is infamous for two things: jawlines sharp enough to slice cheese and an uncanny knack for carrying congenital diseases. Historians still debate whether the infamous Habsburg jaw was the product of inbreeding alone or something more. Syphilis, after all, in its congenital form can wreak havoc on skeletal structure, facial development, and even mental acuity. And as the family continued to intermarry, generation after generation, their collective health seemed to bend under the weight of these twin burdens: hereditary disorder and possible latent infection. Leopold I himself suffers from numerous ailments throughout his life: migraines, tremors, digestive distress, and, as noted in his physician's journals, ulcerations upon the limbs and swellings most foul. He's often seen avoiding sunlight, wearing thick gloves, and consuming bitter teas mixed with mercury. He also has a curiously short temper, with episodes of weeping and violent rage, followed by deep, days-long depressions. One mainstream historical account describes his court as a hive of remedies, and notes that the royal apothecary had entire rooms stocked with herbal tinctures, syrups, and various poultices, some of which contained ingredients that, frankly, would not be out of place in a witch's pantry: ground pearls, mummy dust, and yes, silver powder laced with quicksilver, a quirky tidbit. During a particularly rough winter, Leopold reportedly ordered that all mirrors in his palace be covered. The reason? He believed the disease could reflect itself and spread further through visual transference. The scientific value of this theory? Precisely zero, but the desperation behind it? All too human. The legacy Leopold passes on is a kingdom still teetering between superstition and science, and a family tree increasingly marked by stillbirths, sickly children, and sudden deaths. His descendants, including Emperor Charles VI and the famously resilient Maria Theresa, do their best to mask these afflictions under layer upon layer of powdered dignity. But the cracks show. They always do. From Vienna we glide back to Paris, where perfume still hangs in the air like a defence against truth, and where a grandson of the Sun King prepares to wear a crown that fits less like a halo and more like a noose. Louis XV, whose reign we've touched on, leaves behind not just a legacy of exhaustion and decadence, but a line increasingly thinned by disease and misfortune. Enter Louis XVI, awkward, indecisive, and married to the equally misunderstood Marie Antoinette. Their story ends, famously, in revolution, but in between the silk gowns and sharpened blades lies another character, one not often named, but deeply felt. The Bourbon family's intimate circle had, for decades, harboured rumours of a syphilitic strain running quietly through the bloodline. Louis XIV, in his final years, suffered from painful leg ulcers and facial lesions. Louis XV's indulgences spread whispers and diseases alike. By the time Louis XVI is crowned, the question becomes not whether the dynasty can survive syphilis, but whether it can survive at all. Louis XVI shows no overt signs of illness, but many have wondered about his unusual fertility struggles with Marie Antoinette. It takes them 7 years to produce a child, and the king is rumoured to suffer from phimosis, a condition that could be genetic, or could be aggravated by a venereal disease. Once again, the palace's penchant for euphemism clouds the truth. Doctors report unfavourable humours and prescribe soothing oils, which, if you read between the lines, could just as easily be attempts to treat symptoms of a sexually transmitted infection. And then there are the children. Of their 4 offspring, 2 die young. One of them, Louis Charles, the uncrowned Louis XVII, wastes away in prison during the Revolution, reportedly covered in sores and skin irritations. The records are vague, the accounts contradictory, but they all agree on this. The child died in agony, thin as a whisper with inflammations of unknown origin. Historians still argue whether this was due to prison conditions, abuse, or congenital illness. But the suspicion lingers like smoke in a draped salon. The Bourbon bloodline had been unravelling long before the guillotine did its work. As the flames of revolution lick through France, let's cross over to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, where another king, Sigismund III Vasa, tries to straddle the spiritual and the sensual. Known for his devout Catholicism and strong connections to the papacy, Sigismund is also rumoured to have kept several lovers, both male and female, during his long reign. A curious contradiction for a man so steeped in piety. His reign is marked by military failures and deepening political chaos. But behind the scenes, personal affliction may have played a part. Diaries from Jesuit advisors mention the king's nightly sweating fevers and increasing aversion to strong light. Physicians note sores that open and heal with no provocation, and the king's habit of scratching at his arms until they bled. Sigismund's later years are spent mostly in seclusion, supposedly for religious contemplation, yet records show frequent visits from apothecaries, monks trained in herbal medicine, and foreign doctors carrying mercury compounds and silver syringes. One particularly odd entry in the Royal Medical Ledger includes the phrase, application of the violet fluid, a common nickname for mercuric chloride solution. Open scholarly debate continues over whether these symptoms point to syphilis or simply to ageing. But the parallels to other infected monarchs are hard to ignore. Like so many others, Sigismund left behind a trail of health enigmas that historians still puzzle over, and his heirs, more stillbirths, more frail children, more closed coffins than open cradles. Meanwhile, in the heart of the Russian Empire the Romanovs rise. They ascend with divine certainty and glittering autocracy. But even their fabled grandeur can't repel the spectre of syphilis. Among the early 19th century Tsars, none cuts a more enigmatic figure than Nicholas I. Stern, disciplined, and obsessed with order, Nicholas builds railways, crushes revolts, and maintains tight control over every aspect of Russian life. But his personal life is less pristine. Court rumours suggest Nicholas maintained a series of mistresses, some of whom vanished abruptly from public life. Several suffered women's complaints shortly after bearing him illegitimate children. One, a young ballerina, is quietly sent to a sanatorium after displaying peculiar skin lesions and seizures. Nicholas himself begins to suffer from facial swelling, difficulty walking, and persistent eye infections. His physicians note burning sensations in the soles of the feet, and a peculiar kind of joint pain that seems to migrate. Though no direct diagnosis survives, again palace secrecy being what it is, the symptoms align eerily with advanced syphilitic degeneration. He dies in 1855, supposedly of pneumonia, yet several court accounts mention blackened fingertips and a delirious final week during which the Tsar reportedly spoke in languages he did not know. A stroke? Perhaps. Or perhaps, like so many rulers before him, his mind was finally consumed by an infection that had lingered too long in royal blood. The tragedy of these monarchs is not merely their personal suffering, it's the way their illness sculpted the course of nations. Marriages were arranged or avoided out of whispered fears. Heirs were born flawed, sickly, or not at all. Wars were waged to secure succession lines that were already doomed by disease. And all the while, syphilis remained the silent usurper. It outlived dynasties, it weathered revolutions, it adapted, endured, and often went unmentioned in official chronicles. But behind every trembling hand, every veiled face, every royal crypt that smelled faintly of camphor and wax, there it was, a crown in one hand and a curse in the other. Royalty, in all its grandeur, has long depended on illusion, of strength, of divinity, of unassailable lineage. But beneath the ermine robes and diamond-crusted crowns, bodies rot and minds unravel just like anyone else's. And in no case is this bitter truth more visible, more grotesquely poetic than in the story of Don Carlos of Spain, the ill-fated prince whose life unfolds like a tragic play written by feverish candlelight. Born in 1545 to King Philip II and Maria of Portugal, Carlos is Spain's heir apparent. From his first breath, the expectations placed upon him are enormous. But the first signs of trouble come early. As a child, he is sickly and fragile. He walks with difficulty, suffers frequent nosebleeds, and has an alarming tendency to fly into uncontrollable rages. At age 13, he sustains a serious head injury from a fall down a flight of stairs. Some say it was an accident, others suggest he was pushed. Regardless, he is never the same again. From that moment forward, Carlos's descent is steep and visible. He mutilates animals, screams at servants, and develops what modern observers would classify as psychotic delusions. He claims to speak to ghosts, insists on wearing the same dirty clothes for weeks, and once tries to burn down part of the palace simply to see what God would do. Historians still debate the exact cause of his mental and physical deterioration. Inbreeding is certainly a factor. The Habsburg family tree folds in on itself like an origami disaster. But another theory looms darker, that Carlos was born with congenital syphilis, passed down from one of his already ailing parents. The evidence is circumstantial but chilling. Maria of Portugal, his mother, dies just 4 days after his birth, reportedly of puerperal fever. But some sources note ulcerations and wasting in the final days of her short life. Philip II, the grim, deeply religious monarch known more for the Inquisition than intimacy, nonetheless had his share of extramarital encounters. Syphilis had been present in Spain for at least 50 years by the time Carlos was born, and military campaigns had helped it travel quickly and efficiently into even the most isolated noble veins. Carlos's condition worsens as he enters his late teens. He begins to starve himself, then gorge on meat and wine. He attempts to seduce his cousin. He becomes convinced that his father is poisoning him, and at one point barricades himself in his chambers, threatening to jump from a window if anyone tries to enter. Eventually, Philip can no longer tolerate the instability and has him confined, alone, in total darkness, with guards stationed outside. He remains imprisoned for 6 months before dying at the age of 23. Officially, the cause is listed as natural deterioration, but palace servants later describe his final days as terrifying. His skin covered in sores, his eyes glassy and unfocused, his body trembling violently. One mainstream historical source recounts that, at the time of Carlos's death, his fingernails had turned black and his hair had fallen out in clumps. Whether this was from disease, despair, or both, we'll never know. But he was buried quietly, with little ceremony, and his name faded from popular memory, another unfortunate footnote in a dynasty that preferred saints to scandals. Interestingly, while Spain was hiding away its broken prince, the rest of Europe was not so discreet. In England, whispers about the mental state of royalty reached open speculation with the rise of the Stuart dynasty. But further east, in the court of Denmark, madness wasn't confined to rumour, it lived in plain view. Christian VII of Denmark, whom we've briefly touched on, deserves a closer look now. If Don Carlos represents the physical and emotional ruin of a prince crushed by disease and expectation, then Christian VII represents the puppetization of royalty, an entire kingdom ruled through the trembling hands of a man barely aware he is king. Crowned in 1766, Christian is described early on as clever and eager, but soon his eccentricities begin to eclipse his promise. He refuses to bathe for weeks at a time, dresses in elaborate costumes for no reason, and recites Shakespeare monologues to empty rooms. He's obsessed with masturbation, so much so that his doctors blame it for his declining mental state, coining a term that will haunt medical literature for decades: masturbatory insanity. Of course, today we know such behaviour could indicate schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, but another possibility continues to shadow historical analysis: that Christian contracted syphilis during his early travels through France and Germany, where brothels were as common as bakeries. A Danish ambassador's diary mentions the king's festive evenings in Paris, followed by foul-smelling evacuations and a rash of red stars upon the groin. Not the kind of souvenirs one expects from the City of Light. Christian's reign becomes increasingly unstable. Real power shifts to his physician, Johann Struensee, who effectively governs in his name. Struensee implements radical reforms: freedom of the press, abolition of torture, economic modernization. But he also becomes intimate with Christian's wife, Queen Caroline Matilda, and the resulting scandal explodes like a cannonball through the Danish court. Struensee is executed, Caroline is exiled, and Christian, he is gently removed from public life, like a damaged painting taken off the wall. He lives in isolation until his death in 1808, largely silent, his days filled with childlike behaviour and long periods of staring at nothing. Whether his mind was always fragile or whether a disease slowly hollowed it out remains a mystery. But the parallels to other infected monarchs, the tremors, the paranoia, the long decline, are hard to miss. Another echo of this familiar tragedy rings from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, where Sigismund III Vasa reigns with a golden crucifix in one hand and an iron sceptre in the other. A devout Catholic, Sigismund dreams of uniting all of Eastern Europe under one Catholic crown. His enemies call him rigid, sanctimonious. His supporters call him visionary. But behind his stiff collar and polished armour, Sigismund hides a secret that only his most trusted physicians dare acknowledge. Contemporary reports note his frequent visits to bathhouses, not for pleasure but treatment. He complains of worms in the joints, a heat beneath the bones, and recurring stars behind the eyes. He takes mercury, drinks sulphur-laced waters, and regularly bleeds himself in an effort to control the humours. But these aren't treatments for fatigue or gout, they're the textbook remedies for syphilis. Sigismund's letters to papal advisers are filled with moral despair and self-recrimination. He begs for forgiveness for unspecified sins. He speaks of unclean thoughts visited upon me by devils in human form. And toward the end of his reign, his handwriting becomes so unstable that scribes must complete his missives. His face, once described as noble and symmetrical, becomes bloated and waxy, his gait unsteady, his temper unpredictable. Historians remain divided on the cause of his decline, some citing stress, others pointing to a slow-burning infection. But when his son, Władysław IV, inherits the throne, the pattern continues. Illness, erratic decisions, infertility. A slow withering of dynastic power that seems to echo the quiet spread of disease. And here, drifting back westward, we reach a house that once sparkled like the morning star of European royalty. The Bourbons of France, their palace of Versailles, their powdered wigs, their operas and masquerades, every surface gleams with excess. But beneath it all rot sets in. Louis XIV, the Sun King, may have bathed in golden light during his 72-year reign, but his family suffered the consequences of constant exposure, to court intrigues, to military campaigns, and possibly to syphilis. His brother Philippe is widely known for his libertine lifestyle. His mistresses, both male and female, come and go with alarming frequency. Many die young. Several bear children who do not survive infancy. Louis himself becomes increasingly reclusive in his later years, suffering from painful leg ulcers and chronic infections. He is obsessed with etiquette, smells, and bodily functions. A physician's journal records that he could no longer sit comfortably by age 70 due to persistent inflammation of the lower limbs. Whether from gout, infection, or something more sinister, no one can say for sure. His descendants fare worse. Louis XV, a man of great beauty in youth, becomes a caricature of decadence in age. His private harem, the Parc aux Cerfs, becomes a source of endless rumour and likely of infection. Girls are brought in, used, and dismissed. Some disappear entirely, others reappear months later, visibly ill. One former mistress, in a surviving letter to a confidant, writes of an itch that bleeds and a royal token more painful than pleasurable. Louis himself dies of smallpox, but by then he is already haunted by the deaths of countless heirs and relatives, many of whom suffered from what court doctors describe as mystifying, wasting illnesses. Historians note a cluster of symptoms: skin eruptions, bone pain, sterility, mental confusion. The exact cause? Always elusive. But syphilis lingers at the edge of every theory like a shadow refusing to fade. By the time of Louis XVI, the dynasty is crumbling not just politically, but biologically. His marriage to Marie Antoinette is slow to produce children. Two of them die young. The surviving daughter, Marie-Thérèse, is imprisoned during the Revolution and never marries. The Bourbon line, once a river, becomes a trickle, and behind it all, perhaps, is a parasite that makes no demands but patience. Syphilis doesn't need banners or armies, it only needs hosts, and among Europe's royal families, crammed together by marriage, strategy and tradition, it found them in abundance. The further one delves into the marble halls and velvet-draped antechambers of royal history, the more one begins to see the quiet fingerprints of disease etched into every golden frame. Syphilis is rarely named outright, yet its symptoms trail across centuries like a ghostly signature. Bone rot beneath ermine, madness behind coronets, stillbirths buried beneath dynastic pride. In its most chilling form, it didn't just end lives, it shaped history, often in ways historians still can't fully unravel. One of the clearest examples of this spectral influence comes not from France or Spain, but from the stately courts of Britain, where the famously unpredictable King George III begins a long, tragic dance with illness. Born in 1738, George comes to the throne during a time of expansion, innovation, and increasing tension with the American colonies. For a while things go well. He marries Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, fathers 15 children, and oversees a stable and reasonably respected administration. But in 1788, a storm brews inside the king's mind that no parliament can calm. He begins to talk incessantly, often unable to stop for hours. He repeats himself, confuses identities, addresses people who aren't in the room. He writes bizarre letters, one infamously filled with over 400 words in a single sentence. The courtiers panic. Physicians swarm. Theories abound. Traditionally, George III's affliction has been attributed to porphyria, a rare genetic disorder affecting the nervous system. Yet the symptoms also overlap with neurosyphilis in its advanced stages. Mania, hallucinations, uncontrollable speech, insomnia, and profound paranoia. His physicians administer all the era's standard remedies, leeches, laudanum, purgatives, but to little avail. One particularly fringe but persistent theory suggests that George had contracted syphilis earlier in life, perhaps from a clandestine liaison in his youth. While the image of George as a faithful husband is part of official narrative, contemporary gossip, always hungry for scandal, suggests otherwise. A number of early letters reference wild days in his bachelor years, including extended visits to spa towns notorious for both their healing waters and discreet pleasures. More compelling still are the symptoms. During George's frequent relapses, his skin reportedly becomes blotchy. He experiences sharp pains in his limbs, difficulty swallowing, and increased sensitivity to light, all symptoms consistent with late-stage syphilis. His eyesight deteriorates. His gait becomes uneven. His moods swing from weeping to laughter in seconds. He speaks to birds. He insists that he is not king, but merely a humble servant of Jerusalem. After each episode, he recovers somewhat, lucid, embarrassed, and haunted by the memory of his own mind's betrayal. Eventually, however, the lucidity ceases. By the early 1800s, George retreats almost completely from public view. He spends his final years at Windsor Castle, blind, deaf, and raving. The courtiers maintain the appearance of normalcy. Parliament acts through his son, the Prince Regent. But the monarchy is, in all but ceremony, incapacitated. His burial years later is sombre and understated. No great monument, no romantic legacy, just a whisper of what might have been. And the irony? George's nickname in his early years was Farmer George, for his simplicity and moral steadiness. The public admired him for being unpretentious, grounded. But as history shows, even the most grounded of monarchs can be quietly undone from within. As the British court tiptoes around its fractured sovereign, Denmark continues to feel the aftershocks of its own royal breakdown. Christian VII, still technically king, now lives in a shadow world, neither dead nor truly alive, his mind dulled by years of confinement and confusion. His handlers change frequently. His quarters are kept immaculately quiet. Music is banned, mirrors are removed, even the clock chimes are muffled to prevent episodes. His son, Frederick VI, acts as regent, and eventually king in name as well. But he never officially dethrones his father. The illusion of sovereignty is maintained until the very end, when Christian dies in 1808. His body, reportedly, is covered in what the mortician describes as pale scars and inflamed joints, though no official autopsy is permitted. Once again, the veil is drawn, and behind that veil the whispers continue. Was it madness? Was it divine punishment? Or was it simply the inevitable end of a body burdened by a disease that refuses to announce itself plainly? A similar narrative unfolds in the Portuguese court during the reign of Queen Maria I. Known as Maria the Pious during her earlier years, she earns a more tragic moniker later in life. Maria the Mad. Initially her reign is promising. She rules with intelligence and grace. She enacts reforms, supports the arts, and maintains stability in a kingdom often rocked by its larger Iberian neighbour. But in the 1790s things begin to unravel. First comes the grief. Her husband dies, followed by her eldest son. Then the delusions. She believes she's damned, that God has abandoned her, that demons whisper to her through the tapestry walls. Her attendants report that she wails through the night, alternately praying and screaming. Physicians diagnose her with melancholia, a fashionable term for mental collapse. But one, more daring, suggests something else. A wasting affliction of the royal blood. This phrase appears in only one surviving document, but it's suggestive. By that time, syphilis was known to affect behaviour in profound ways. Maria's symptoms, severe insomnia, hallucinations, auditory delusions and physical tremors, mirror those of known syphilitic cases from the same period. Moreover, her husband was rumoured to have kept multiple mistresses. The possibility that Maria contracted the disease from him and that it remained latent for decades before manifesting so spectacularly cannot be dismissed. She's eventually declared insane and removed from power. Her son João rules as regent, then king. Maria is relocated to Brazil for the remainder of her life, where she dies in 1816. Her body, when returned to Portugal, is interred quietly. The legacy of her reign remains complicated, a queen of promise, undone by shadows that may have crept into her blood decades before. And if Portugal had its mad queen, France had its share of royal decay too, though increasingly, by the early 19th century, the monarchy is less an institution and more a cautionary tale. After the fall of Napoleon and the Bourbon Restoration, King Charles X takes the throne. He is pious, conservative, and determined to roll back the revolutionary clock. But like so many of his lineage, Charles appears physically diminished. Observers note his pale complexion, his aversion to bright light, and a peculiar nervous tic in his hands. He often retreats early from public engagements, citing headaches and tender limbs. Letters from his personal physician reference cinnabar infusions and the application of the lunar paste, terms associated with mercury-based treatments. Was Charles X afflicted by the same silent predator that haunted his ancestors? We can't be sure, but what we do know is this: his reign ends not with triumph, but with abdication. He flees to Britain, then to Austria, where he lives out his final days in obscurity, surrounded by caretakers and far from the palace halls that once echoed with royal decree. Meanwhile, medicine begins to evolve. By the mid-1800s, the true nature of syphilis becomes clearer. The bacteria Treponema pallidum is identified. Treatments improve, slowly. But in the courts of royalty, stigma remains. No monarch ever admits to infection. No official portrait bears the truth. Instead, we find clues in the margins, in footnotes, in personal letters, in medical records cloaked in euphemism. And still, syphilis lingers, not just in the body, but in the lineages, in the failed dynasties, in the succession crises, in the lonely heirless deaths. It leaves no monument, but its legacy lies buried in the royal crypts of every European capital. One final oddity worth mentioning before this chapter closes. During the Victorian era, a number of British and Austrian nobles began commissioning portraits of themselves with hands deliberately obscured or tucked into coats. Art historians long interpreted this as symbolic modesty or deference to Napoleon's famous pose. But recent studies suggest something else: hands affected by syphilitic deformity, twisted fingers, ulcerated knuckles, discoloration. Easier to hide behind a painter's brush than to confess in court. So here we are at the threshold between fading monarchies and rising modernity, with syphilis still seated at the high table. It's not just a disease anymore, it's a quiet co-author of history, uncredited, unspoken, but undeniably present. The winding corridors of history often echo louder with whispers than proclamations, and few whispers resound with more venomous consistency than those surrounding the tormented body and mind of Christian VII of Denmark, a monarch whose crown fit like a straitjacket. We've met him before, briefly, as a marionette in the hands of his physician, Johan Struensee, and as the reluctant star in Denmark's most operatic political triangle. But now, let's draw the curtain all the way back on his reign, a rare window into the day-to-day agony of a king consumed, perhaps, by syphilis. Born in 1749 to King Frederick V and Queen Louise of Great Britain, Christian VII is surrounded by luxury, strict Lutheran piety, and palace tension from the first breath. His mother dies when he is a child, and his father remarries a woman who, by many accounts, cares little for Christian and dotes obsessively on her own children. This early neglect, combined with high expectations and overexposure to court politics, breeds a child already prone to nervous habits and obsessive behaviour. As a teenager, Christian is intelligent but erratic. He engages in frequent self-harm, suffers from night terrors, and begins what will become a lifelong habit of muttering to himself. Courtiers try to ignore it, tutors try to discipline it away, physicians recommend calming tonics, music, and, when none of those work, short trips to Paris and Hamburg, where the young prince can exercise his freedoms, which of course is palace code for visiting brothels. Records from this period, guarded and cryptic, nonetheless suggest Christian contracts something unpleasant before his 18th birthday. He returns from his exercises pallid and irritable, complaining of groin pain and facial tingling. His personal valet notes a persistent rash beneath the royal waistband, and a German physician is summoned only to prescribe the usual Renaissance remedy, mercury rubs and bed rest. And here the theory arises, one not universally accepted but difficult to dismiss, that Christian VII may have contracted syphilis during his teenage years and carried it, untreated or poorly treated, throughout his adult life. As king, Christian's behaviour becomes more theatrical. He laughs during funerals, mimics his advisors, and insists that his pet dog be addressed as a baron. He makes impulsive decrees, then forgets them hours later. He walks the halls at night muttering to paintings and refuses to eat food that isn't dyed red. Court officials try everything: discipline, seclusion, religious intervention, but nothing curbs the spiral. Then enters Struensee, a German physician with Enlightenment ideals and a steady hand. He becomes Christian's caretaker, shadow, and surrogate mind. For a time, it works. Christian appears healthier. He attends meetings. He signs reforms. But behind the scenes, Struensee is writing those decrees, managing court life, and falling in love with Queen Caroline Matilda. Their affair, once discovered, is dealt with swiftly and viciously. Struensee is executed, Caroline is exiled, and Christian, he collapses into himself as though the final thread holding him to reality had been snipped. For the remaining decades of his life, he is a shell, shuffling through palace corridors, scribbling strange symbols into furniture, and occasionally shouting at statues. His physical condition deteriorates too. He develops tremors. His vision falters. He experiences full-body spasms and complaints of burning sensations in the spine and knees, symptoms consistent with tertiary syphilis. But the word is never used in court documents. Instead, his ailments are described as God's affliction, or noble misalignment of the faculties. When Christian finally dies in 1808, the royal obituary describes him as a gentle spirit burdened with earthly heaviness, an elegant phrase for a man who lived most of his reign in a state of quiet torment, treated not with sympathy, but with containment. Meanwhile, Christian's descendants are left to rule a Denmark scarred by scandal and afraid of introspection. His son, Frederick VI, avoids addressing his father's condition altogether and redirects focus to policy, diplomacy and stability. But that nervous fear of inherited disease lingers in the Danish court for generations. A line of monarchs who govern, yes, but always with an eye on their own hands, their own thoughts, as if waiting for something within to turn against them. As Christian VII's lonely legacy echoes across Denmark, a similar dissonance rings in the marble halls of Spain. Here, we descend into the latter stages of the Bourbon dynasty's decay, a decay hastened not by revolutions or assassins, but by what might very well be the biological backlash of centuries of close marriages and concealed infections. One figure who embodies this decline with tragic clarity is Ferdinand VII of Spain. Born in 1784, Ferdinand lives through one of the most chaotic centuries in Spanish history. He's deposed, restored, betrayed, and eventually regains the throne after Napoleon's defeat. But behind his political fluctuations lies a personal affliction that haunts his entire reign. By the time he is king in full, Ferdinand is already sickly. Portraits from his early rule depict a narrow face, sallow skin, and distant eyes. He marries multiple times, first to his cousin, then to a series of carefully chosen noblewomen, all with the intent of producing a healthy male heir. But the results are grim. His wives suffer repeated miscarriages. The children that do survive die young or are plagued by chronic illness. Ferdinand himself suffers from facial palsy, hand tremors, and insomnia. His moods swing wildly, from affection to fury, from melancholy to grandiosity. He is deeply paranoid, dismissing ministers at the slightest provocation and keeping multiple doctors in rotation so no single one knows the full truth. One of these doctors, writing anonymously in a medical journal years later, describes treating a monarch with ulcerative episodes and neuralgic shocks. The language is careful but telling. These are classic indicators of tertiary syphilis, and while no official diagnosis is ever recorded, several palace correspondences refer to the necessity of silver water, a euphemism for mercury treatment. By the time Ferdinand produces a surviving daughter, Isabella II, the Bourbon line is wobbling like a table with one leg shorter than the others. And when he dies in 1833, he leaves behind a kingdom divided, a regency in disarray, and a child queen whose health, both mental and physical, will remain the subject of whispers for years. The pattern repeats itself in house after house. In Prussia, King Frederick William IV, educated, cultured, and initially beloved, suffers a massive stroke at age 56 that leaves him mentally incapacitated for the final 7 years of his reign. Historians attribute the cause to arteriosclerosis, but a small, insistent group argues otherwise. Letters from his court mention persistent shunkers and a long bout of fevered dreaming. He is said to have believed the statues in his palace moved at night, whispering secrets from the walls. In Austria, the great Habsburg Empire begins to fracture not only politically but internally. By the time Emperor Ferdinand III takes the throne in 1835, the family's long-standing reputation for medical anomalies has become an open joke in European salons. Ferdinand is epileptic, hydrocephalic, and suffers from what modern scholars believe was profound developmental delay. His famous line upon learning he was king, "I am the emperor, and I want dumplings." Was Ferdinand the result of generations of inbreeding alone? Quite possibly. But it's just as plausible that syphilis, contracted somewhere along the branches of his family tree, helped sculpt the peculiar angles of his mind and body. And so the empire staggers on, less a roaring lion than a wheezing artifact, crumbling beneath its own decadence. Through all this, the disease persists in the shadows, not just of bodies, but of institutions. It weakens lineages, it alters diplomatic marriages, it derails succession. The palace physician becomes as politically important as the prime minister. Royal births are celebrated with growing unease. Every cough from a prince, every faint from a duchess, each is scrutinised, dissected, and more often than not hidden. And as the 19th century gives way to the 20th, medical science finally begins to peel back the veil. Robert Koch identifies Treponema pallidum, the bacterium responsible for syphilis. New treatments emerge, arsphenamine, and eventually penicillin. But it's too late for most of the royal victims we've traced. Their lives and deaths are already engraved into history. Their secrets, embalmed in euphemism and buried beneath cathedrals, linger only in side notes and speculative scholarship. Still, every time a historian finds an overlooked letter or a conservator uncovers a royal portrait painted over lesions, the same ghost raises its head. A ghost with no crown, no sceptre, just a soft cough, a broken smile, and a long, quiet reach. By the dawn of the 20th century, the gilded empires of old Europe begin to show more than cracks. They tremble at their foundations. Industrialization races ahead, war clouds gather, and revolution stirs in the hearts of the discontented. The age of monarchs is not yet dead, but its breath grows shallow. And still, deep within the private chambers of royal residences, syphilis lingers like a tenant who refuses to leave. Nowhere is this presence more haunting than in the twilight halls of the Romanovs. The imperial family of Russia, once so confident in its divine mandate, carries within its bloodline not only the seeds of political tragedy, but also the whispered possibility of something darker, something chronic, hidden and fatal. Tsar Nicholas I, who rules from 1825 to 1855, is often portrayed as the iron-willed autocrat, a man of discipline, order and cold resolve. He is the archetype of imperial masculinity, tall, stoic, with an icy stare that chills diplomats into submission. But as with so many rulers of his era, the image does not tell the whole story. Court records from his later years describe troubling symptoms, chronic headaches, leg pain that forces him to walk with a limp, uncharacteristic bursts of temper, followed by long stretches of withdrawal. A courtier notes that Nicholas would stare for hours at a single object, sometimes muttering to himself. Another writes that the emperor had developed an unnatural sensitivity to sound, flinching at the clink of cutlery or the creak of a door. Was it stress? Undoubtedly. Ruling Russia was not a job for the faint-hearted, but among these vague symptoms one detail stands out. his recurring eye inflammation. Described as a filmy white veiling over the pupil, it came and went in unpredictable cycles, sometimes affecting one eye, sometimes both. Today, ophthalmologists recognise this as a symptom of ocular syphilis, which occurs in later stages of the disease and was notoriously hard to diagnose before the advent of modern medical tests. Nicholas's physicians administered treatments that raise further suspicion: mercury-based ointments, baths infused with herbs known to combat venereal impurities, and repeated heat cures, where the Tsar was wrapped in hot cloths until he fainted. These were not standard responses to gout or stress. They were the desperate rituals of doctors fighting an invisible and unforgiving invader. His mistresses, of which he had several, also suffered from female complaints, and were often dismissed quietly, pensioned off to distant estates. One, a French ballerina, reportedly lost all her teeth before the age of 30 and died after a lingering decay of the bones. Another was sent to a monastery after developing a facial ulcer no makeup could cover. Nicholas's decline was slow but steady. He grew quieter, more pious. He spent increasing amounts of time in his private chapel, sometimes kneeling for hours. In the end, it was pneumonia that officially claimed him, but his last days were marked by delirium and pain, consistent with neurosyphilitic degeneration. He died clutching a crucifix, murmuring phrases that made sense only to him. The torch passed to Alexander II, who seemed healthier, more vibrant, but the question of infection didn't vanish. After all, syphilis doesn't just destroy bodies, it haunts bloodlines. It raises the spectre of congenital infection, where children are born already touched by the disease, a kiss of death delivered in the womb. That spectre is perhaps most tragically embodied in the heir to the last Romanov Tsar, Alexei Nikolaevich, son of Nicholas II and Alexandra. Now, Alexei is primarily known for his haemophilia, the bleeding disease that brought the mystic Rasputin into the imperial circle. But some fringe scholars argue that the official narrative may not capture the full scope of his afflictions. Alexei suffered from joint pain, fevers, and episodes of intense confusion. While haemophilia explains the bleeding, it doesn't account for the neurological symptoms, nor does it explain certain skin lesions recorded in the private journals of Alexandra, rashes that appeared overnight and wept clear fluid for days. One physician, writing under a pseudonym, described the boy's episodes as beyond blood. Something inside is wrong, not just with his veins, but with his soul. Of course, the Russian Revolution cut short any chance of modern diagnosis. The entire family was executed in a basement in 1918, their bodies buried in unmarked graves and later recovered, missing bones and teeth. Autopsies confirmed haemophilia. But as for syphilis, if it was present, it went to the grave with them. Another royal secret swallowed by gunfire and time. As the Romanovs fell, the medical world outside the palace gates finally began to catch up. In 1905, Fritz Schaudin identified Treponema pallidum, the bacterium responsible for syphilis. A few years later, the Wassermann test enabled doctors to detect it in blood. And in the 1940s, penicillin provided a true cure, merciful, effective, and decades too late for those already interred beneath marble. But these discoveries didn't erase the past. They merely illuminated it. Medical historians began re-examining old letters, autopsy reports, and family trees, and what they found was startling. A pattern of decay, not unlike the disease itself, hidden just beneath the surface of royal grandeur. Take the Habsburgs once again. In the twilight of their empire, just before its collapse at the end of World War I, Emperor Franz Joseph ruled from the opulent Hofburg Palace in Vienna. He's remembered for his stoicism, his long beard, and his tragic personal life, especially the suicide of his son, Crown Prince Rudolf, at Mayerling. Rudolf's mental state had long been in question. He suffered from insomnia, migraines, and violent mood swings. He kept strange company, including radical politicians, occultists, and aging actresses with rumoured addictions. He also frequented brothels, sometimes under disguise, sometimes openly. Police records from Vienna's red light district list a tall man with imperial posture among the known clients of a syphilitic madam who later died in a public hospital, covered in sores and babbling about a man who gave her silver and then gave her worms. Rudolf's relationship with his father was cold, his engagement to Princess Stephanie was strained, and his politics veered left while his empire veered right. Eventually, in 1889, He and his teenage mistress, Baroness Mary Vetsera, were found dead in a hunting lodge. The official explanation? A murder-suicide pact. But again, details muddy the waters. Rudolf's autopsy was sealed. His father banned mourning clothes. Stephanie never spoke publicly about his health, but private letters, released decades later, mention his loathsome sores and episodes of dreadful despair. His hair had thinned, his gums bled, his hands shook, and one courtier, daring to write what others only whispered, called him a man dying from the inside out. As Rudolf died, so too did the Habsburg dream. By 1918 their empire was gone, shattered by war, rebellion, and the slow erosion of public faith. A dynasty that once stretched across Europe now occupied only dusty rooms in fading palaces. And among the causes of that collapse, alongside poor governance, military defeat and ethnic tension, one must now consider the role of inherited disease, both physical and psychological. Syphilis didn't just corrode bodies, it corroded trust. It turned royal heirs into liabilities. It made political marriages dangerous gambles. It produced children who could not rule and rulers who could not think. And because it could not be named, it could never be properly addressed. It thrived in silence, in shame, in secrecy. In other words, it thrived in palaces. Even the British monarchy, so carefully scrubbed of scandal in public memory, bore its scars. Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Avondale, the eldest son of Edward VII and second in line to the throne, died suddenly in 1892 at age 28. The official cause? Pneumonia following influenza. But letters from his valet describe persistent illness, mood swings, and a peculiar ulcer on his thigh. Albert Victor, nicknamed Eddie, was rumoured to have visited male brothels, and some modern writers have connected him, dubiously, to the Jack the Ripper case. Most of that is speculative nonsense. But what is certain is that Eddie was sick, unwell in a way that doesn't align neatly with influenza. His early death reshaped the line of succession, making way for his younger brother George, who would become George V, and eventually Elizabeth II's grandfather. Had Eddie lived and reigned, the course of British history might have shifted dramatically. But as with so many royal stories, illness chose the timeline. By the early 20th century, syphilis began to retreat, not from palaces, but from invisibility. Medical language evolved. Stigma softened slightly. Public health campaigns began, but its legacy in royal history remains largely unwritten, implied, suspected, or dismissed. What we know now is this: syphilis destroyed far more than bodies. It warped dynasties. It reshaped marriages. It decided wars, derailed peace treaties, and turned promising rulers into tragic footnotes. And for over 400 years, it did all this without ever officially appearing in royal archives. It was perhaps the most powerful advisor the world has ever known, present in every throne room, whispering in the ears of emperors, kings, queens, and popes. Uninvited, unseen, and very, very patient. The illusion of royal invulnerability begins to shatter in earnest as the 20th century charges forward with trench boots and typewriters. Monarchies, once protected by centuries of tradition and layers of ceremonial armour, are increasingly seen for what they truly are: fragile, human, and deeply flawed. And at the centre of this fragility, woven through family trees and preserved behind oil paintings, remains syphilis, the disease that destroyed from within, yet almost never made the headlines. Of all the 20th century monarchs who bore the weight of this silent affliction, none did so with quite the same tragic duality as Pedro of Portugal and Brazil, a man straddling two worlds, old world aristocracy and new world idealism. Pedro I of Brazil, also Pedro V of Portugal, is a revolutionary emperor, a liberal reformer, and, in the end, a deeply tormented soul. Born in 1798, Pedro grows up in exile as Napoleon's invasion forces the Portuguese royal family to flee to Brazil. There, amid the tropical humidity and complex colonial politics, Pedro comes of age surrounded by luxury, resentment, and the occasional peasant uprising. He is intelligent and passionate, prone to grand gestures and intense romances. He marries young, but quickly becomes infamous for his numerous affairs, none more scandalous or revealing than his long entanglement with Domitila de Castro, the Marchioness of Santos. Pedro writes hundreds of love letters to Domitilla, many of which survive today. They are florid, poetic, and uncomfortably explicit. In one, he writes of a burning that only your lips can soothe. In another, he describes the illness of longing that stings worse each dawn. For years, historians assumed these were just dramatic flourishes, but in light of modern understanding, they read more like the laments of a man already in the grip of physical torment. Pedro's health begins to decline in his early 30s. He suffers from unexplained fevers, persistent rashes, and chronic pain in his lower back and thighs. He becomes irritable, withdrawn, and increasingly obsessed with religious redemption. Domitilla's own letters speak of Pedro's dark moods, and his silent hours of pacing, muttering like a ghost. Some days, she writes, he refuses to be touched, even by her. His court physicians prescribe all the usual remedies of the time: hot baths, camphor compresses, bloodletting, and most tellingly a rotating schedule of mercury compounds. One physician notes suppurating lesions along the spine and ulcers of a revolting nature, though these are never publicly disclosed. Instead, Pedro's affliction is referred to simply as a constitutional disorder. By 1834, Pedro is dead at age 35, emaciated and nearly blind. The official cause is tuberculosis, but the symptoms recorded by those closest to him do not align neatly with pulmonary illness. Instead, they match what we now recognise as late-stage syphilis, particularly the neurosyphilitic form that affects memory, behaviour, and personality. And yet, even in death, Pedro's legacy is romanticised. In Brazil, he's remembered as the liberator who declared independence with a shout of "Independencia ou morte." In Portugal, he's the king who abdicated twice, choosing freedom and idealism over the trappings of royal power. But beneath that bronze veneer lies a man broken long before his final breath, quite possibly by the same disease that undid so many of his European cousins. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic and up through the pine-shadowed ridges of Scandinavia, another royal family is quietly grappling with its own genetic reckoning. The House of Bernadotte in Sweden, descended from a French soldier-turned-monarch, prided itself on modernity and reform. Yet even here, syphilis leaves its subtle touch. Oscar II, King of Sweden and Norway from 1872 to 1907, is remembered as a progressive ruler, a patron of science, literature and constitutional governance. But in his later years, his health takes a dramatic downturn. Reports note not only chronic fatigue and joint stiffness, but also recurring skin lesions and visual hallucinations. Oscar's private physician, Carl Sanderson, kept detailed journals, much of which remained sealed for decades after the king's death. When finally released, they contained references to violent nocturnal confusion, ulcerative conditions below the waist, and the repeated use of liquor mercurialis, a common mercury-based treatment for syphilis. Oscar was never publicly diagnosed with the disease, but behind closed doors the symptoms appear unmistakable. Interestingly, Oscar's illness coincides with increased secrecy in the Swedish royal household. Public appearances grow rarer. Official portraits are delayed. Ministers take on more duties and rumours swirl, quietly, cautiously, that the king is no longer wholly of this world. In time, Oscar's grandson Gustav VI Adolf would ascend the throne and work diligently to distance the family from any hint of scandal. He emphasised scholarship, archaeology, and clean governance. But the whisper of disease still trails behind the Bernadottes. Soft, persistent, impossible to disprove. And yet, perhaps the most unsettlingly intimate case of royal syphilis emerges not from a palace, but from a monastery, where a queen, driven mad by grief and possibly by infection, walks the line between sainthood and tragedy. Joanna of Castile, better known to history as Juana la Loca, Joan the Mad, is often portrayed as a victim of courtly manipulation and psychological fragility. But dig deeper into her timeline, and you uncover a disturbing possibility: that her famed madness was not solely emotional, but physiological, and that her lifelong spiral was hastened by a disease contracted in love. Joanna marries Philip the Handsome of Burgundy, a man whose reputation for infidelity is matched only by his political ambition. He is handsome, yes, but also reckless, with a long string of lovers and a penchant for excess. Joanna, deeply enamoured, tolerates his betrayals, but her health begins to falter within the first few years of their marriage. She experiences extreme jealousy, paranoia, and violent emotional swings. She becomes obsessive, refusing to be separated from Philip, even after his death. According to chroniclers, she carries his coffin with her as she travels, occasionally opening it to kiss the body and wail. Most histories attribute this behaviour to profound grief or hereditary insanity. But some suggest something else, that Joanna, through Philip's sexual recklessness, contracted syphilis. Her mental decline, her documented skin eruptions, her aversion to light and sound, these align not just with melancholia, but with neurosyphilis. Her confinement by her father Ferdinand, and later by her son Charles V, is framed as necessary for governance. But perhaps it was also a desperate attempt to hide an affliction that brought shame upon the crown. Her later years are spent in near-total seclusion. Servants report that she speaks to the air, refuses to bathe, and fears mirrors. She claims angels sing to her at night, but also that devils crawl under her skin. Whether these were symptoms of untreated infection, or simply the echo of trauma, we'll never fully know. But Joanna's story, like so many others, fits into a now familiar mould. A royal woman undone not only by politics and patriarchs, but quite possibly by the secret disease of dynasties. And through these stories, of Pedro and Joanna, Oscar and Alexei, a pattern continues to emerge. Syphilis was not merely a disease of brothels and sailors, it was a disease of courts, of velvet couches and silver spoons, of honeymoon beds and baptismal gowns. It lived in the lungs of empires and whispered in the ears of kings. It passed from lover to lover, from ruler to heir, from past to present. It reshaped policy, influenced diplomacy, and turned strong hands to trembling. And perhaps most insidiously, it silenced its victims with shame. They suffered in shadows, behind closed doors and euphemistic prescriptions, as their doctors nodded solemnly and prescribed another course of poison disguised as cure. Because that too must not be forgotten. The treatment was almost as deadly as the disease. Mercury, the go-to remedy for centuries, did little to kill Treponema pallidum, but plenty to erode bones, damage kidneys, and wreck minds. For some, the cure accelerated the very madness they were trying to stave off. For others, it masked the symptoms just long enough to produce a child, one already carrying the burden in their blood. That's how syphilis really conquered the thrones of Europe, not in sudden death, but in slow unravelling, in coughs that wouldn't stop, in moods that couldn't stabilise, in heirs who didn't arrive, or worse, arrived broken. And still, no monarch ever stood before their people and confessed. No royal doctor ever issued a public diagnosis. It remained always a hidden affliction, a palace parasite, a crown and a curse. Step quietly now into the dusky halls of Catherine de' Medici's court, a place where lace and blood dance together under tapestries thick with both dust and rumour. Here, in the echoing chambers of 16th century France, you'll find not only poisoned gloves and dancing masks, but also the faint scent of mercury drifting through the air like forgotten perfume. Because behind the orchestras and horoscopes, Catherine may have managed more than marriages. She may have managed a court riddled with syphilis. Catherine de' Medici, Queen Consort to Henry II of France, and later regent to her sons, was many things. A political mastermind, a feared matriarch, and, according to some, the quiet orchestrator of more than one demise. Her Italian roots gave her a mystique at the French court, blamed for both black magic and bitter wine, but her real power lay in her control of the monarchy's inner circles, including its most intimate afflictions. While no surviving letter explicitly names syphilis, there are signs everywhere that it crept like a mould into the House of Valois. Henry II, her husband, sustained a fatal jousting injury in 1559, but not before years of extramarital escapades with Diane de Poitiers and other court favourites. The king's health had already begun to falter before the lance pierced his skull. Rashes, chronic fatigue, and whispered visits to his apothecary for silver treatments. Historians still debate whether Henry himself carried syphilis, but the behaviour and health of his sons suggest something troubling running just beneath the painted surface. Francis II, Charles IX, and Henry III, Catherine's three ruling sons, each display a distinct pattern of decline: short reigns, erratic behaviour, infertility, and mysterious ailments. Francis II, married to Mary, Queen of Scots, dies at just 16. Officially his death is blamed on an ear infection that spread to the brain, but court records mention recurring fainting spells, mouth sores, and pain that left him bedridden for weeks. His voice is described as strained and hoarse, and he often vomited after meals. Was it simply infection, or an inherited illness eating away at him from the inside? Then comes Charles IX. His reign, though slightly longer, is marked by violent mood swings and deep paranoia. He orders the Saint, Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572, leading to the slaughter of thousands of Huguenots. Some historians attribute this horrific act to political pressure. Others see a more personal madness. Charles is described in letters as a man besieged by invisible foes, and his final months are riddled with coughing fits, weight loss, and what his physician cryptically calls le vent noir, the black winds. He dies at 23, hemorrhaging from the lungs, the sheets beneath him soaked crimson. Tuberculosis, they say. But there are murmurs of sores that would not heal, of rotting breath, and mercury pills hidden beneath the rosary on his nightstand. And then there's Henry III, the last of Catherine's sons to wear the crown. Stylish, theatrical, and fiercely intelligent, Henry embraces fashion and ceremony with a flair unmatched by his predecessors. He surrounds himself with young male courtiers known as the mignons, and fosters an atmosphere at court that drives his enemies to brand him a decadent. Whether or not he was bisexual, as some suggest, is less the point than this. His reign is deeply entangled in personal scandal and physical deterioration. Henry suffers from migraines, joint pain, and frequent absences from court. His physicians prescribe mercury vapour baths and drainings, a procedure involving pierced pustules and bleeding through leeches. He frequently retreats to religious contemplation, flagellating himself and seeking forgiveness for unspecified sins. One surviving letter, scribbled in his own hand, reads simply, "My soul is blistered like my flesh." He is assassinated in 1589 by a fanatic monk, but by then his reign has already become an extended funeral dirge. The Valois line dies with him, its bloodline exhausted and riddled with rot. Whether from disease, despair, or divine judgment, no one dares say for sure. But Catherine had seen it coming. In her private cabinets, alongside horoscopes and poisons, she kept a collection of Venetian glass bottles labelled in Latin, some for perfumes, others for purges, a few unmistakably for treating syphilis. Aqua vitae with silver, one reads. Another, lunar solution for sores of the tender region. She never speaks of these to anyone, but they remain listed in palace inventories long after her death, and Catherine's legacy. Beyond her political cunning and theatrical mourning veils, she leaves behind a court that cannot reproduce, cannot heal, and cannot tell the truth without setting its tapestries ablaze. Elsewhere in Europe, another family tree begins to blacken at the edges. The Habsburgs, never strangers to strange ailments, show signs of a deeper, more corrosive affliction during the reign of Leopold I. Born in 1640, Leopold is a devout Catholic and composer of sacred music. But behind his serene expression and Habsburg jawline lies a man deeply familiar with pain. Leopold suffers from chronic arthritis, skin eruptions, and insomnia. He takes to pacing the palace at night, mumbling to saints, and holding a crucifix to his temple as if warding off a migraine, or something worse. His marriages, multiple and politically strategic, produce children, yes, but many are weak, deformed, or dead within weeks. Of his 16 children by 2 wives, more than half die in infancy. Physicians prescribe wine mixed with mercury and a powder made from ground emeralds. One court recipe involves boiling frogs in vinegar and applying the resulting paste to the groin, an act so absurdly medieval it defies parody. But these were the remedies of royalty, and beneath their pomp lay pure desperation. Leopold's physical decline is gradual but steady. He develops tremors, his eyes become glassy and unfocused, his breath, courtiers whisper, smells like copper and death. When he dies in 1705, the court mourns, but no one seems surprised. His autopsy notes a blackening of the inner tissues and calcification of the bones, though the language is carefully stripped of specifics, but the real toll is felt in the generations that follow. Joseph I and Charles VI, his sons, both display symptoms of chronic illness and emotional instability. Joseph dies young. Charles lives long enough to father Maria Theresa, but her own children will suffer repeated stillbirths and miscarriages. The dynasty lurches forward like a marionette with broken strings. And so, too, does the disease. France, meanwhile, is now under the control of the Bourbon dynasty, and the Sun King's court glows with gold leaf and candlelight. But while Louis XIV embodies splendour, his descendants shimmer less brightly. His grandson, Louis, Duke of Burgundy, is a young man of promise who dies in 1712, along with his wife and eldest son, within the same brutal week. Officially, they succumb to measles, but the symptoms, oozing sores, delirium, necrotic tissue, hint at something far more sinister. Could an entire branch of the royal tree have collapsed under a sudden epidemic? Or was it a deeper, inherited vulnerability? Historians still argue whether this was simply bad luck or an underlying condition shared by father, mother and child. But one obscure court record mentions that the royal physician administered blue elixir in the days before their deaths, a compound commonly used to treat syphilitic lesions. The Duke of Burgundy's surviving son, the future Louis XV, grows up sickly and isolated, surrounded by suspicion and tutors more interested in his bodily functions than his education. He is instructed in restraint, yet becomes one of France's most libidinous monarchs. His private harem at the Parc aux Cerfs is an open secret, and many of the girls, some barely teenagers, leave the estate with rashes, fevers, or worse. Louis XV himself shows signs of a long-term affliction by his mid-40s. He becomes lethargic. He complains of joint pain and blinding headaches. His breath takes on a fetid sweetness, and he demands perfumes be lit constantly in his rooms. Physicians prescribe mercury pills, but he detests them, calling them the devil's sugar. By the time he succumbs to smallpox in 1774, some believe he was already dying from something slower, more shameful. And so it is with monarchs across Europe, names changing, robes changing, but the same patterns repeating. Syphilis stalks the highborn not with fanfare but with patience. It doesn't kill immediately. It waits. It hides in children. It blooms in middle age. It transforms kings into patients and heirs into husks. And all the while, it is never named. Only hinted at in phrases like constitutional weakness, the royal malady, or simply the whispering death. The poisons in Catherine de' Medici's cabinet were many, but perhaps the deadliest was the one she didn't brew, the one she inherited and passed on. Drift now into the vast, echoing marble corridors of the Habsburg Empire, where the bloodlines are long, the chins are pronounced, and the whispers carry further than the echo of an organ's final chord. Within this dynasty, syphilis does not appear as a sudden explosion of illness, as it had in the violent sweats and boils of earlier generations. It presents instead as a long, slow, inevitable unravelling. A rot not just of the body, but of the very architecture of royal rule, and few Habsburgs demonstrate the disease's insidious dance through genetics and generations like Emperor Leopold I. Yes, we've already stood beside his night candles and watched him mutter prayers into an empty chamber, but let's pull the curtain back wider, this time to trace the arc of a family caught in a spiderweb of both medical fragility and whispered scandal. Leopold I ruled from 1658 to 1705, an impressively long reign. He was pious, deeply Catholic and largely conservative, except, oddly enough, in his quiet tolerance of the bizarre. A court composed of eunuchs, dwarves, mystics, and leech vendors flourished under his watch. It would all be charmingly eccentric were it not for the undercurrent of panic. These were not the trappings of opulence but the accoutrements of desperation. Leopold married 3 times. His first wife, Margarita Teresa of Spain, was both his niece and only 15 at their marriage, because of course nothing says dynastic stability like marrying into a tighter genetic coil. She died young after several unsuccessful pregnancies. Leopold then married Claudia Felicitas of Tyrol. Again, no healthy children. Finally, with Eleanor Magdalene of Neuburg, he had a flock of children, including his successor, Joseph I. Now Joseph is where the pattern becomes undeniable. Handsome, intelligent, and energetic, Joseph was the kind of heir the Habsburg court prayed for. But even before his ascension in 1705, there were signs of something off. Personal letters refer to his tendency toward excess, and court physicians noted a number of skin anomalies and sudden humoral inversions. Translation, he had sores. But the real evidence comes from Joseph's private life, and particularly from his wife, Wilhelmina Amalia of Brunswick-Lüneburg. Their marriage began with promise, but within a few short years Wilhelmina was suffering repeated miscarriages and illnesses. In a rare surviving letter to her sister she writes, "My breath burns as though it were fire itself, and I bleed at times where there should be no wound." If that's not a syphilitic testimonial, it's certainly a convincing audition. Their 2 daughters survive infancy, but Joseph never produces a legitimate male heir. He dies young, at just 32, from what is officially recorded as smallpox, but privately described in palace journals as an affliction of the flesh and mind that left the royal body open and weeping. His brother, Charles VI, takes the throne, and while Charles lives longer, his reign is similarly plagued, literally. His wife, Elizabeth Christine, suffers from fainting spells, headaches and depression. Their only surviving child is Maria Theresa, who will go on to become one of the most formidable rulers of the 18th century. But even she cannot escape the family curse. Maria Theresa births 16 children. Of these, several die young. One son, Charles Joseph, reportedly suffers from chronic nosebleeds and is described as strangely silent by age 5. Another, Maria Carolina, dies before her first birthday. Her heir, Joseph II, lives to adulthood, but shows an alarming resemblance to his uncle Joseph I, not just in name, but in temperament and health. Joseph II is known as the revolutionary emperor, favouring Enlightenment reforms and medical progress. But he also displays classic symptoms of chronic illness: eye pain, mood disorders, and a strange red patch on his chest that appears in his early 30s and never fully fades. He has no surviving children despite 2 marriages. His letters grow increasingly morbid. "My crown weighs no heavier than my flesh," he writes once. Both are infested. He dies alone, disillusioned, and bloated with illness at just 48. The cause? Uremia, say the doctors. Unquiet blood, says a monk who served at his bedside. In private notes, his physician recommends post-mortem boiling to sterilise the remains. A harsh measure, but not unheard of for royals suspected to carry lingering contagions. Meanwhile, the Habsburg branches elsewhere in Europe are faring no better. Spain's Habsburg line comes to an ignominious end with Charles II, whose grotesque physical deterioration has long been a topic of both pity and morbid fascination. His jaw juts, his tongue barely fits his mouth, and he cannot eat without assistance. He is sterile, he suffers from seizures. His autopsy, performed in 1700, lists a heart the size of a peppercorn, lungs rotted by corruption, and a single black testicle entirely barren. There are many theories to explain his condition, extreme inbreeding chief among them, but syphilis may have played a supporting role. Charles's mother, Mariana of Austria, was herself the product of repeated cousin marriages, and while there's no direct evidence of venereal disease, there is plenty of circumstantial smoke, erratic behaviour, chronic skin infections, and a dynasty collapsing into reproductive failure. After Charles II dies, the War of the Spanish Succession erupts, a massive conflict triggered by the simple fact that a royal line had withered too far to bear fruit. Think about that. A global war fought because one man couldn't produce a viable heir, possibly because of a disease passed down by lovers and hidden behind closed doors. But syphilis doesn't just end lines. It quietly reprograms entire dynastic priorities. In the 18th century, as these infections became more visible, if still unspeakable, marriage negotiations began to include an unspoken emphasis on fresh blood, new genetic material untainted by incest or scandal. That's why minor German princesses began marrying into England and France. It wasn't just politics, it was triage. You see this clearly in the marriage of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. She is young, foreign, and most importantly, from a different branch of the Habsburgs, one that had spent the last generation carefully diversifying its bloodlines. But by the time they marry, the damage to the Bourbons is already done. Louis XVI suffers from phimosis, a condition that makes intercourse painful or impossible. Though it's commonly described as anatomical rather than venereal, the symptoms, pain, inflammation, long delays in conception, match early syphilitic infection in some medical texts of the time. Whether he had the disease or not, the result was a delayed consummation of the marriage and a frustrated, gossip-hungry court. Marie Antoinette, for her part, is blamed for everything from frivolity to treason, but she too becomes a target of medical scrutiny. She suffers several miscarriages, as well as uterine distress described in court reports. In private correspondence, she complains of phantom swellings and intense fatigue. Was it stress, nerves, or something more? Of their 4 children, 2 die young. The Dauphin, Louis Charles, who would have been Louis XVII, is imprisoned during the Revolution and dies at 10, ravaged by illness and neglect. His symptoms, chronic rashes, skeletal pain, blurred vision, align eerily with congenital syphilis. No autopsy was conducted. The body, buried in haste, left more questions than answers. Even Marie's surviving daughter, Marie-Thérèse, is childless after her marriage into the Bourbon-Parma line, and so another branch curls back into itself and withers. A dynasty that had ruled France for centuries ends not with battle, but with biology. Back in Vienna, the pattern continues. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, as the 19th century winds down, becomes less an empire and more a museum, preserving traditions even as the world barrels toward modernity. The aging Emperor Franz Joseph presides over it all, stoic and hollow-eyed. His wife, Elizabeth of Bavaria, known as Sisi, becomes a ghost within the court, obsessed with beauty and travel. Their son, Rudolf, dies in the infamous Mayerling-suicide pact with his mistress, possibly driven to the edge by both emotional and physical decay. Rudolf's autopsy is sealed, but decades later, memoirs from a Viennese physician describe treating a Habsburg prince afflicted with erosions of the mouth and hallucinations of drowning in gold. The implication: syphilis had not gone quietly, it had merely put on opera gloves. And then World War I arrives and topples it all. The empires fall, the monarchies crumble, and the royal bloodlines scatter like dust. But even in their final moments, they carry the echoes of the disease that shaped so much of their fate. Syphilis never wore a crown, but it lived in the bedchambers of kings and queens. It hollowed out heirs before they could inherit. It derailed policies, broke alliances, and erased dynasties not with a roar, but with a slow, seeping silence. In the empire of the infected, no one ever ruled alone. By the late 1700s, the grandeur of Versailles stands as a glittering illusion. Crystal chandeliers illuminating slowly fading bloodlines, powdered wigs masking receding hairlines, and layers of rouge covering more than just vanity. For France's royal family, the Sun King's legacy is not one of unbroken glory, but a fragile mirror, cracked with scandals, sickness, and secrets. And as this mirror reflects across generations, it lands squarely on 3 unfortunate souls, the grandsons of Louis XIV, all named Louis, each carrying within them more than just a name. Louis, Duke of Burgundy, Louis, Duke of Brittany, and finally Louis XV. 3 men, 3 paths, and 1 inescapable shadow, syphilis. Let's start with the eldest, Louis, Duke of Burgundy. The grandson of Louis XIV and heir apparent, the Duke was raised in the court's gilded cocoon, a world where tutors spoke in Latin, meals were ceremonies, and illness was something to be hidden, not healed. As a child, Burgundy was described as bright, pious, and unusually sensitive. He wept at the suffering of animals and reportedly once begged forgiveness from a page he had scolded. The court saw in him a softer kind of king, a philosopher in a crown. But the image begins to crack as Burgundy enters adulthood. He marries Marie Adélaïde of Savoy, a vivacious and intelligent princess, and for a brief period they become the court's golden couple. But whispers grow louder. The Duke suffers from severe headaches. He is increasingly absent from courtly affairs. His complexion turns pallid. He sweats excessively during winter. One physician notes the presence of suspicious spots at the base of the spine and recommends repeated baths in mercury-rich water, which, at this point in history, is a common, if disastrously ineffective, remedy for syphilis. In 1712, tragedy strikes with eerie precision. First, Marie Adélaïde falls ill. Then Burgundy follows. Both die within a week of each other, officially from measles. Yet court documents reveal discrepancies. The Duchess's body was reportedly covered in pustules uncharacteristic of measles, and the Duke suffered seizures and delirium before death. One contemporary letter from a courtier simply states, "They are taken by the black kiss. Too close. Too soon." Their son, The second Louis in our ill-fated trio, the Duke of Brittany, dies shortly thereafter, still a toddler. Official cause? Complications from his parents' illness. But multiple accounts describe him as sickly even before the outbreak. He had difficulty feeding, cried incessantly, and suffered periodic rashes. Could congenital syphilis have already marked him? Modern historians remain divided. Some say the clustering of deaths was viral misfortune. Others aren't so sure. The deaths devastate the royal family, and with the throne suddenly vacant of heirs, attention turns to a frail, quiet boy, Louis, Duke of Anjou. He's only 5 when his elder relatives die, but by age 11 he is crowned Louis XV, and from the very beginning his body seems to betray him. Throughout his adolescence, Louis XV is plagued by mysterious ailments, fevers without explanation, skin eruptions that come and go, a sensitivity to touch that defies logic. His doctors rotate like courtiers, each with a new theory, none with success. Despite this, Louis grows into a strikingly handsome man, earning the nickname Le Bien-Aimé, or the Beloved. He marries, produces children, and for a time, the monarchy feels stable again. But soon the cracks widen. Louis XV becomes restless. He withdraws from political affairs. He indulges in hunting, gambling, and increasingly elaborate affairs. His most infamous pursuit, the establishment of the Parc aux Cerfs, a private mansion near Versailles, where young women, some barely past childhood, are brought to serve as his mistresses. The court justifies it as the needs of a virile king. The people call it what it is, a scandal. Many of the girls suffer afterward. Letters from court physicians describe genital ulcers, unexplained fevers, and eruptions that return with the moon. At least 2 are quietly institutionalized for melancholia and trembling. One, the daughter of a minor noble, dies mysteriously within weeks of leaving the king's care. Her body is buried in haste. Her name vanishes from the records. Louis himself begins to deteriorate. His once sparkling eyes grow dim. His hands tremble. He complains of a persistent ringing in his ears and sharp pain behind his eyes. His mood swings become legendary. Flirtatious at breakfast, cruel by dinner, and weeping by night. He asks for prayers, confessions, and more perfumes. His room is constantly filled with burning herbs, not just for fragrance, but to cover the ill vapours, as one servant euphemistically puts it. Physicians prescribe more mercury, then antimony, then, in desperation, leeches. The sores on his legs worsen. His walk becomes stiff, almost mechanical. Court records never officially acknowledge the possibility of syphilis, but by now the signs are too consistent to ignore. He dies in 1774 after a prolonged illness declared to be smallpox, but autopsy notes, later found in a physician's journal, describe necrotic tissue in the jaw and a degradation of the nasal cavity, hallmarks of syphilitic destruction. His death is not mourned by the public. The once beloved is buried hastily, without the pageantry typically afforded to a French monarch. The disease that had simmered in his blood for decades finishes its work without pomp or protest. And the legacy he leaves? A powder keg. The court is already drowning in debt. The people are already starving. His successor, Louis XVI, is too weak and too late. Revolution is no longer avoidable. It's inevitable. And when it comes, it is not just a rebellion against tyranny. It's a rebellion against rot. The Bastille may have fallen in 1789, but the foundation had been eroded long before, eaten away by policies, yes, but also by disease, by heirs that never were, by minds that unravelled, by monarchs who could no longer fulfil the most basic duty of their office, continuity. Meanwhile, back in Spain, another Louis struggles against the tide of sickness and succession. Louis I of Spain, son of Philip V and Elizabeth Farnese, is crowned king in 1724 at just 17. He is a boy king, eager to please and full of idealism, but his reign lasts only 7 months. He contracts smallpox, they say. But whispers suggest another cause. Louis had been ill prior to his coronation, suffering from insomnia, genital lesions and mood swings. His wife, Louise Elizabeth d'Orléans, reportedly refused to share a bed with him by their 3rd month of marriage. One physician, in a letter to a Jesuit priest, writes of a sickness that passes through the blood like wildfire and leaves no virtue untouched. When Louis dies, he leaves behind no heir. His father, Philip V, resumes the throne, a rare reversal in monarchic history. Spain's succession is preserved barely, but the scars remain. For the rest of his life, Philip is plagued by rumours that his son died not of natural causes but of inherited infection. The Orléans branch, connected to the Bourbons through Louis's marriage, also struggles with a string of unexplained illnesses and early deaths. A private physician to the family compiles a secret ledger titled The Book of Shadows, a list of symptoms, prescriptions, and suspected contaminations. Among the entries, the child's tongue is blackened before the week is done. Ulcers appear behind the ears, then vanish. She sleeps with her eyes open and weeps when awake. All this, the decay, the disfigurement, the political upheaval, flows from a root that is as intimate as it is invisible. Syphilis, after all, is not just a disease. It is a story, told in fevers and miscarriages, in erratic kings and childless queens, in cribs that are too often empty. It is a story of empires unravelling at the seams of their most private moments. And it has one more gift, anonymity, because no king ever stood at a balcony and confessed. No queen ever admitted to the burning. The truth was always buried in euphemism and embalming fluid. Only the effects were visible, painted into portraits, woven into genealogies, etched into history like scars. 3 Louis, 3 fates, 1 disease. Not all their names are remembered, but their symptoms are. In the twilight corners of the European stage, where royal splendour mingled with incense and inherited shame, not every monarch wore a crown of gold, some wore it of fire, and as we leave the sun-dappled courts of France and Spain behind, we now turn our gaze toward the misty corridors of Poland, where one king, a man caught between confessional piety and carnal pleasure, may have danced too closely with the disease that toppled giants. Sigismund III, Vasa ruled the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth from 1587 to 1632, a reign both long and divided. On one hand, he was a staunch Catholic monarch, a patron of art, and a fierce advocate for royal absolutism. On the other, he was a man accused of obsession with appearances, indecision, and a chronic fatigue that became the gossip of ambassadors. In portraits, Sigismund appears stoic and regal. But like so many of his contemporaries, the canvas hides what the body betrayed. His health, particularly in his later years, deteriorated in ways both ordinary and oddly suspect. He suffered recurring skin eruptions described vaguely in court records as summer swellings and holy discomforts of the groin. He was noted for his increasing irritability and frequent nosebleeds, as well as erratic decision-making. In his journals, largely religious in tone, there are repeated references to trials of the flesh, a phrase historians argue may refer to illness, temptation, or both. Of course, to suggest that Sigismund had syphilis is to wander into speculative territory, but let's consider the circumstances. He spent years in royal courts across Europe before ascending the Polish throne, frequently travelling between Krakow and Stockholm during the Wars of Succession. His father, John III of Sweden, had sown seeds in more than a few royal and not-so-royal gardens. And Sigismund, raised in the decadent courts of Sweden and later Rome, was no stranger to the pleasures of the body, even if he often cloaked them in penitential gloom. His wife, Anna of Austria, bore several children, but many died in infancy. The pattern is familiar by now. Pregnancies marked by miscarriage, children born weak or malformed, and mysterious childhood deaths referred to as fevers of the marrow. One surviving son, Ladislaus IV, would become king himself, but his own health was similarly unpredictable, and his reign too was dogged by rumours of impotence and melancholia. At the time, court physicians rarely used the term syphilis openly in royal medical records. Instead, they referred to the French disease, the great pox, or even the swelling sin. In Polish sources, it often appears as choroba królewska, the royal disease. One physician to Sigismund, a German Jesuit-trained doctor named Jakub Langenfeld, wrote in his private notes of administering powdered cinnabar and wormwood in prayerful dosage to the king for his nightly anguish. Powdered cinnabar, of course, is mercury. The ritual of treatment was both absurd and intimate. Each night, Sigismund was wrapped in red wool cloth soaked in mercury ointment and laid upon heated tiles, where he would sweat out the corruption, while priests recited psalms. He grew fond of cedar oil and frankincense, not merely as indulgences, but likely to mask the smell. Because the stench of mercury-treated syphilis was, according to contemporary letters, enough to clear a chamber. But there's more to Sigismund's story than just the potential diagnosis. His reign, long and uncertain, was marked by repeated military and political miscalculations, many of which modern historians have re-evaluated in light of his declining mental state. He lost Sweden. He failed to unite the Catholic factions of Eastern Europe. His policies shifted dramatically from day to day. And in his final years, he became increasingly obsessed with relics and astrological forecasts, reportedly refusing to make decisions without consulting the stars. One papal envoy wrote of him, "His Majesty is a man guided by the calendar of Mars, not the advice of men." Another noted that the king spoke to himself often and wept at odd hours. Whether this was spiritual fervour, mental illness, or a symptom of syphilitic degeneration remains an open debate. But the similarities to other afflicted monarchs, Henry VIII, Ivan the Terrible, Christian VII, are hauntingly familiar. Sigismund's death in 1632 was quiet. Officially it was from natural causes, but he spent his final months in near seclusion, refusing to be seen in daylight. His last days were marked by fever, trembling, and an almost complete retreat from speech. When he died, his body was embalmed quickly and buried with minimal ceremony, perhaps to hide visible damage. His son would take the throne, but Poland would begin its slow descent into political fragmentation soon after. And then, as if the disease were taking a moment to reflect on its own reach, it surfaces once again, this time within the long echoing colonnades of the Russian Empire. The Romanovs, ascendant and increasingly paranoid, had learned from their neighbours' mistakes, publicly at least. While other royal houses tried to disguise their infected heirs with silence and exile, the Romanovs doubled down on orthodoxy and military pageantry. But behind the walls of the Kremlin, the disease played the same games. Nicholas I, ruling from 1825 to 1855, was a rigid, militaristic ruler who styled himself the Iron Hand of Russian order. He suppressed revolts, censored literature, and upheld a regime of moral strictness so severe it bordered on asceticism. And yet, like his predecessors, he struggled with a body that did not obey the ideals of the empire. Accounts from court physicians describe the Tsar's increasing health troubles in his later years. Chronic eye pain, skin disorders, and what one diary euphemistically called troubling emissions. He developed rashes, suffered nerve pain in the legs, and underwent a series of peculiar treatments involving silver-infused linen and prolonged exposure to cedar smoke. Though syphilis is never named in official records, it appears as a ghost behind the medical jargon. One aide wrote, "His Majesty's affliction is not of war but of the blood." Thus, another mentions his fear of mirrors in his final years, claiming that the emperor had all reflective surfaces covered in his study. Perhaps it was spiritual, perhaps it was shame, but most damning is the record of his illegitimate children. Nicholas I was not celibate. He is known to have taken several mistresses during his life, including ballerinas and noblewomen, and at least one bore a child who died shortly after birth, described as blue and rigid with lips split. These details suggest congenital syphilis, though again, such diagnoses were cloaked in euphemism. His death was attributed to pneumonia, but letters from a palace servant claim he died in a fevered whisper, seeing lights that did not burn and visitors that no one else could see. Whether hallucination or visitation, it fits the well-trodden pattern. Nicholas's son, Alexander II, would go on to earn the title the Liberator Tsar for ending serfdom. But even Alexander could not entirely escape the family shadow. His own assassination would be brutal and public, but his private life, including the prolonged illnesses of several children, continues to raise eyebrows among historians who trace the persistence of infection through generations. And so from Poland to Russia, the story repeats. Syphilis, shrouded, persistent and devastating, continues to tug at the seams of monarchy, pulling threads with cruel precision. Kings who should have ruled decades die in youth. Princes born with promise live only in painted portraits. Queens retreat from court, miscarrying in silence. Physicians write in codes, their margins dark with truth. And all the while the disease advances, unacknowledged but deeply felt. The deeper one looks into these royal lineages, the clearer the pattern becomes. It's not just misfortune, it's biological history, recorded not in textbooks, but in family trees that wilt, bend, and finally snap. The lamps of old Europe dim slowly. From London to Vienna, from St. Petersburg to Madrid, monarchies creak beneath the weight of centuries' scandal and increasingly sceptical subjects. No longer shrouded in the mystique of divine right, royalty is now watched with growing scrutiny by revolutionaries, journalists and scientists alike. And as the 19th century marches toward its fin de siècle, one quiet truth clings to the edges of every coronation, every stillborn cradle, every muffled scream behind velvet drapes. Syphilis has not retreated, it has merely adapted. And as the disease evolves, so too do the treatments, entering a new chapter equally fascinating and grotesque, the age of mercury and madness. Let's step into the hidden rooms behind the thrones, into the physicians' chambers, the bathing closets, and the travelling apothecaries where desperate royals and their doctors fought syphilis with fire, silver, and superstition. This is a world where science is alchemy's awkward cousin, where poison is prescription, and where the pain of the cure often matches the agony of the affliction. For centuries, mercury was the go-to weapon against syphilis, rubbed into the skin, swallowed in tiny doses or injected directly into open sores. It was thought to chase the bad humours out. Royal physicians across Europe swore by it, despite its ruinous side effects: salivation, tooth loss, kidney failure, madness. The phrase, "a night in the arms of Venus leads to a lifetime on Mercury," wasn't just a poetic warning, it was medical prophecy. In France, Louis XIV's personal doctors developed a method known as fumigation therapy, in which the patient sat naked in a specially constructed box with only their head protruding. The chamber was then filled with vaporized mercury. The idea was to purge the disease through sweating. The reality? Many patients suffered chemical burns and neurological damage. Still, it remained a preferred treatment in the French court well into the 1700s. Across the Channel in England, Queen Anne's physicians administered what they called the silver wash to her consort, Prince George of Denmark. George had long suffered from respiratory issues, swelling in his joints, and ulcers along his scalp, symptoms suspiciously aligned with tertiary syphilis. While never officially diagnosed, the household records show a steady supply of cinnabar tincture and blue ointment, both mercury-based. Perhaps the most disturbing treatment trend among royals was the calomel cure. Calomel, or mercurous chloride, was ingested to purge the bowels, based on the flawed theory that expelling bodily fluids could flush the disease. The side effects? Vomiting, bloody diarrhoea, and, in prolonged use, something known as mercurial erythrism, a condition that causes irritability, trembling, and delusions. The case of George III comes to mind again. While traditionally believed to have suffered from porphyria, there is significant evidence that he was given high doses of calomel during his periods of madness. His journals reflect increasing paranoia, confusion, and agitation, likely symptoms not of the disease itself but of the treatment meant to cure it. In Vienna, the Habsburgs embraced their own array of bizarre remedies. Emperor Franz I, husband to the formidable Maria Theresa, reportedly took part in a ritual known as mercurial bathing. This involved lying in shallow water infused with mercury, silver nitrate, and crushed garlic bulbs, believed to draw bad spirits out through the skin. The emperor, who suffered from constant leg pain and poor circulation, believed it helped. His doctors noted, however, that his skin became grey and his teeth loose after several months of therapy. Then there were the theriac plasters, medicated pastes made from opium, honey, and over 70 exotic ingredients, including viper flesh. These were applied to the chest or groin and left on for days. Royal physicians across Germany and Italy swore by them. One concoction, known as the Black Queen salve, was reserved exclusively for noblewomen thought to be suffering from internal leprosy, a catch-all diagnosis that almost certainly included late-stage syphilis. We also find references to bloodletting with leech modulation, a favoured practice in Tsarist Russia during the reigns of Nicholas III and Alexander III. If a patient exhibited tremors, skin lesions, or insomnia, leeches were applied to the temples, wrists, and inner thighs. The treatment was painful, and often led to secondary infections, but was considered a mark of elite suffering. The Romanovs, with their obsession for physical purity and religious endurance, embraced this practice with zeal. Perhaps the most tragically ironic treatment of all, though, came from the hands of royal quacks, charlatans and pseudoscientists who promised miracle cures to desperate monarchs. These range from snake oil merchants to self-taught alchemists, many of whom enjoyed brief but intense favour within the courts. One such figure, Johann Baptista van Helmont, claimed to have cured a Habsburg prince using roasted frog legs soaked in brandy and sprinkled with powdered emerald. Another, Dr. James Graham of London, famously constructed the celestial bed, a contraption fitted with electrified magnets and aromatic vapours meant to restore fertility and expel venereal disease. At least 2 British dukes reportedly used the device, though whether it produced anything more than static and scandal is unclear. The strange intersection of religion and medicine also played a role. In Spain, confession and syphilis treatment often went hand in hand. Priests served as both spiritual counsellors and informal diagnosticians. The phrase purifying through penance referred as much to the body as to the soul. A nobleman might be bled on Tuesday, bathed in vinegar on Wednesday, and flogged with birch branches on Thursday, all in the name of both spiritual and physical cleansing. In Catholic France, one Jesuit doctor advocated fasting combined with exposure to sacred music and relics. He claimed that playing the organ to syphilitic patients at sunrise hastened recovery. While there's no scientific basis for this, it illustrates the desperation and sometimes sheer creativity of the time. There were also animal-based treatments that defy belief. In certain German courts, it was fashionable to consume blue milk from goats fed on mercury-laced herbs. The logic was simple. If the goats could metabolize the poison, their milk must hold some essence of the cure. Spoiler, it did not. But it did keep a steady trade of mercury-fed livestock alive among aristocratic circles. Even the garments of royalty bore traces of their affliction. Underneath the velvet, many monarchs wore lead-infused linens or bandages soaked in camphor oil, an attempt to draw the disease out through the pores. Queen Caroline of Ansbach, wife of George II, reportedly owned a wardrobe filled with tinctured underthings, which were rotated daily and burned after wear. As the 19th century closed and germ theory gained ground, these bizarre practices began to fade. Arsenic-based treatments like Fowler's solution replaced mercury, and eventually, in the early 20th century, Salvarsan, a compound developed by Paul Ehrlich, became the first targeted drug to fight syphilis with some measure of success. Penicillin would arrive decades later to finally end the disease's grip. But by then, the damage was done. For 4 centuries, the royal response to syphilis had been equal parts silence and spectacle. They hid it behind masks, veils, and cryptic poetry. They fought it with poison, prayer, and plasters made from vipers. And through it all, the disease endured, morphing from a scandal to a chronic nuisance, then to a national crisis, and finally to a quiet, lingering stain on the pages of royal genealogy. It is perhaps fitting that the treatments themselves became their own form of affliction. What was supposed to cleanse the blood instead poisoned the mind. What was meant to restore strength only eroded the bones faster. Mercury, in all its gleaming promise, mirrored the royalty it served, shining on the outside, corroding within, and behind every flickering candle in a palace sick room, behind every physician's quill and whispered diagnosis, the disease watched patiently. It needed no throne, no army, no banner. It needed only a kiss, a night, a name, and sometimes not even that. From the perfumed misery of mercury-laced court chambers to the desperation of arsenic and electric beds, royal attempts to cure syphilis had already spanned centuries. Yet for all the grotesque ingenuity in treatment, one bitter truth clung stubbornly to the tapestries. Syphilis didn't just destroy individuals, it dismantled entire dynasties. And by the turn of the 20th century, the whispers that once curled behind closed doors began echoing loudly in the halls of diplomacy, succession, and global warfare. It begins, as so many royal affairs do, with a marriage. Across Europe, arranged unions were the mortar of monarchy. Strategic pairings designed to consolidate power, acquire territory, and reinforce bloodlines. But by the late 1800s, those same bloodlines had been so tightly interwoven that disease, once isolated, could now sweep through nations with the grace and ease of a state dinner invitation. Syphilis, having taken root among earlier rulers, now found itself carried not by courtesans or soldiers, but by princes and princesses in bridal procession. The most telling example of this dynastic entanglement unfolds through the tragic trajectory of the Saxe, Coburg and Gotha family, a house that seeded itself across Europe like ivy, touching Britain, Belgium, Portugal, and Bulgaria. In particular, the British and Russian branches provide a sobering case study in royal downfall, political and biological alike. Let's examine Edward VII, son of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, and perhaps one of the most notorious philanderers ever to sit on the British throne. Before becoming king in 1901, Edward, then Prince of Wales, spent decades cultivating a lifestyle that could politely be described as indulgent. His known affairs included actresses, aristocrats, and at least one French courtesan reputed to have infected half the Parisian upper crust. One woman, Lily Langtry, wrote cryptically in her diary of a prince whose embrace glows too hot, like silver in sunlight. Others were less poetic. Physicians treating Edward throughout his life noted persistent urogenital discomfort, chronic fatigue, and a thickening of the voice, which was at the time associated with tertiary syphilis affecting the throat and larynx. And while no official diagnosis was ever made public, he was, after all, the Prince of Wales. Edward's periodic absences from court, his repeated convalescences at spas across Europe, and his dependency on tonic wines all point toward a recurring affliction. More tellingly, he passed on none of his vigour to his son George V, who lived a far more subdued life, and took deliberate steps to clean up the monarchy's image, possibly in response to the scandals of his father's generation. But if Edward was a storm cloud over Buckingham, then his cousin Nicholas II of Russia stood under a deluge. The last Tsar of the Romanov dynasty, Nicholas ruled an empire cracking at every edge. Social unrest, industrial revolution, and the looming spectre of war threatened the throne. But so too did something more insidious: his family's fragile health. Much has been written about Alexei, the haemophiliac heir, whose life hung by a thread and whose suffering haunted his parents. But the health issues of Nicholas himself and his wife Alexandra suggest deeper, older roots. Alexandra, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, carried not only haemophilia in her genes but a host of lesser-known afflictions. She complained of burning eyes, numbness in the hands, and fevers without cause. In private letters, she described periods of intense melancholy and a strange rash that would emerge during times of stress and vanish without treatment. Nicholas, too, showed signs of chronic illness. His diaries often mentioned nerve pain and fatigue so thick it smothers thought. Court physicians prescribed heavy opiates and occasional mercury salves, and Rasputin, the infamous mystic brought in to treat Alexei, wasn't just guiding prayer. He advised against foreign potions and insisted that the imperial couple stop taking certain chemical wines. Scholars today speculate that these may have been arsenic or mercury-based tonics, commonly used to treat syphilis. Could the royal couple have been carrying the disease? It's impossible to say definitively. But it's worth noting that both Nicholas and Alexandra withdrew increasingly from court life during their later years. They became hermits in ermine, obsessed with ritual and religious redemption. And as the world outside their palace burned, they remained oddly passive, paralysed by a lethargy that seemed to run deeper than politics. Then came World War I, and with it, the fall. The Romanovs were executed in 1918. No autopsies were performed, but photographs of Nicholas from his final months show a man aged beyond his years, his posture bent, his face gaunt, his hands gnarled. One historian described him as a man already half buried. Another whispered, it was not bullets that killed the Tsar, it was something slower. Meanwhile, the Habsburgs of Austria-Hungary were fighting their own invisible war. Franz Joseph, the aging emperor, had watched as syphilis quietly dismantled his family from within. His brother Maximilian had died in Mexico under dubious circumstances. His son, Rudolf, had died in the Mayerling murder-suicide, and his nephew, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was assassinated in Sarajevo, an act that sparked World War I, but before that gunshot, before the treaties and trenches, there was already rot beneath the surface. Rudolf, the Crown Prince, exhibited extreme mood swings, insomnia, and an obsession with death. He wrote morbid poetry, isolated himself from court, and was rumoured to have contracted syphilis from one of his many mistresses. His relationship with Baroness Mary Vetsera, the 17-year-old girl who died beside him, was steeped in desperation. Some believe Rudolf was already dying, mentally or physically, and chose suicide over decay. Whether his illness was hereditary, venereal, or both, the result was the same: no heir. no future. And so, the dominoes fell. Monarchies that had ruled for centuries collapsed in a matter of years. The Romanovs, the Habsburgs, the German Kaisers, the Ottomans, each undone by war, yes, but also by bodies that could no longer bear the weight of crowns. Syphilis, in many ways, was the quiet prelude to revolution, a biological betrayal hidden in plain sight. Historians still argue whether syphilis played a decisive role in the fall of these empires. Some say the disease's impact is overstated, that political incompetence, class struggle, and technological change were the real culprits, and they're not wrong. But to ignore the role of health, and especially secret, shameful illness, is to miss the full tragedy. Because at its core, syphilis is the perfect metaphor for monarchical decay. It begins with pleasure, spreads in silence, masks itself in mimicry, and ends in collapse. It corrupts from within. It turns strength into weakness, certainty into paranoia, airs into husks. It's not dramatic like assassination. It's not swift like battle. It's slower, sneakier. Royalty was built on blood, and syphilis made that blood its kingdom. And so we reach the early 20th century, a world on fire filled with broken thrones and boarded palaces. Monarchs now ride in motorcars instead of carriages, but many still carry within them the last genetic embers of an ancient affliction. A disease once feared, then hidden, now increasingly treatable, though the damage has long since been done. No longer can syphilis topple empires. Penicillin arrives in the 1940s and burns the parasite from human history like sunlight through fog. But the echoes remain, in family trees, in unexplained madnesses, in miscarriages no longer mourned. Syphilis, once the silent killer of kings, becomes a ghost story told in footnotes and forensic reports. But for 400 years, it was very real and very royal. The fall of dynasties wasn't just political, it was microbial, a microscopic rebellion that passed from one fevered embrace to the next, from cradle to crown, from bedchamber to battlefield. And in the end, perhaps the most fitting legacy of syphilis isn't death at all, it's silence. The silence of empty palaces, the silence of unspoken diagnoses, the silence of dynasties too proud to admit they bled. Even with the fall of monarchies and the arrival of the modern medical era, syphilis did not vanish. It simply went underground. And as it retreated from the headlines and coronation halls, its legacy lingered like smoke in a forgotten ballroom. For centuries, syphilis had left its fingerprints on dynastic marriages, secret births, childless unions, and scandals hidden behind velvet drapes. But now, with kings gone or reduced to ceremonial ribbons, the question must be asked: what did the disease leave behind? More than any one ruler or reign, syphilis reshaped the very architecture of European power. It redrew borders, not by war, but by inheritance failure. It cancelled coronations not with bloodshed, but with infertility, and perhaps most remarkably, it pushed monarchies toward extinction by doing what they feared most, ending the line. Take the marriage market, for instance. Before syphilis, royals treated marriages as chess moves, strategic, arranged, and often between first cousins. But as the disease crept from one bloodline to another, the approach changed. Suddenly, diversity mattered. Fresh blood was prized. By the late 1700s, a young noblewoman from a minor duchy could find herself married to a future king simply because her ancestors hadn't intermarried for a few generations. Historians still argue whether this shift was driven by scientific knowledge or sheer desperation. Likely, it was both. Medical observations, however crude, began to link congenital illness with close blood ties. Autopsies, still rare among royals, occasionally revealed abnormalities so extreme they could no longer be ignored. In some cases, foreign physicians were quietly hired to assess potential brides and grooms for vitality, though what exactly they were checking remains, well, vague. The disease also influenced religious and political attitudes. In Catholic countries like Spain and France, syphilis was often interpreted as divine punishment, a result of sin, excess, or heresy. Monarchs were encouraged to fast, donate to the church, and confess often. Confessionals, in fact, became a kind of informal medical record. Priests knew which nobles were sick before their doctors did. In Protestant states, the disease was framed more as a natural consequence of immoral behaviour. English kings were judged more harshly for their mistresses, not out of piety, But because syphilis was no longer seen as a distant foreign ailment, it was here, in the brothels of London and the backrooms of Whitehall, and it had infected more than a few in the House of Hanover. George II, for example, suffered repeated skin eruptions and chronic bladder issues during his reign. His physicians tried to hide the nature of his ailments, but letters to his daughter reveal a man increasingly obsessed with drainings and foul vapours. One particularly colourful court rumour claimed he kept a silver whistle by his bed to call for poultices in the night. Whether true or not, it paints a vivid picture of how syphilis became a permanent guest in royal bedrooms. But perhaps the most remarkable consequence of syphilis was how it broke the unspoken rule of royalty, that bloodlines must endure. Again and again, the disease proved that lineage was not destiny, that no matter how grand the title, how opulent the throne, a single microscopic organism could unmake an empire in silence. The Spanish Habsburgs, with their famously tangled family tree, offer the clearest example. After Charles II died childless in 1700, the dynasty ended. Not in battle, but in exhaustion. Every marriage, every alliance had failed to produce a healthy heir, and the reason, quite possibly, was syphilis, inherited, untreated, and undiscussed. But the disease didn't just destroy, it distorted. Kings grew paranoid, queens were locked away for hysteria, physicians were either silenced or banished for honesty. Treatments grew more extreme, more desperate. There were kings who drank liquefied pearls, queens who bathed in wine, heirs who were given mercury before they could speak. And it didn't stop at Europe. Syphilis rode on ships to every corner of the empires. As European royalty extended their dominion into Africa, Asia, and the Americas, they brought with them not just muskets and flags, but infection. Colonial governors caught the disease in local brothels. Indigenous leaders were exposed through treaties sealed with marriage. In some tragic cases, royal explorers left behind more than maps. They left entire populations racked with venereal disease. By the 1800s, syphilis had become both an epidemic and a metaphor. It symbolised decline, decay. The idea that no empire, however mighty, was immune to rot. And nowhere was that metaphor more fitting than in the crumbling palaces of Austria-Hungary. Franz Joseph, who ruled longer than any emperor in European history, watched his entire family fall around him. His brother executed, his son dead by suicide, his wife stabbed, his nephew assassinated. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, once a vast web of cultures and alliances, slowly unravelled like a moth-eaten curtain. Franz Joseph himself suffered from chronic leg pain, digestive issues, and what his doctor called neurotic melancholy. Whether it was syphilis or simple despair is unclear, but the pattern fits: the silence, the fatigue, the endless funerals. Then came World War I and the last act. In the years that followed the Great War, Europe's monarchies crumbled like sugar sculptures in rain. The Russian Romanovs were executed, the German Kaisers exiled, the Ottoman sultans stripped of power, and the Austrians reduced to ceremonial figures in a republic that had no more use for crowns. It's tempting to credit war and revolution alone for these collapses. But to ignore the biological underpinnings, the childless unions, the unstable heirs, the secret infirmities, is to miss half the story. Because in many ways, syphilis did what revolutions only finished. It softened the soil. And long before the people rose up, the palaces were already sinking. There are, of course, exceptions. Not every monarchy fell. Some adapted, rebranded, or quietly purged the sick from the succession line. The British monarchy, for instance, survived by embracing restraint, press management, and the appearance of moral rectitude. But even they bore the scars. Edward VIII, the king who abdicated for love, was long suspected of syphilitic infection, a theory fueled by his sudden weight loss, mood swings, and sexual reputation. In Japan, Emperor Taisho, who reigned from 1912 to 1926, showed signs of a mysterious neurological disorder, believed by some scholars to have been tertiary syphilis. He spoke in clipped sentences, walked with difficulty, and was often kept out of public view. His son Hirohito would later rule in his place, and Taisho's condition was carefully edited from official records. And in the Middle East, as dynasties clashed with modernity, whispers of venereal disease were sometimes wielded as political tools. A sultan's inability to produce an heir was not just a private sorrow, it was a potential coup. syphilis had done something extraordinary. It had turned biology into politics, and politics into biology. It made the personal public, the hidden, decisive. It wasn't just a disease, it was a curse, not because it struck the wicked, but because it thrived in silence, in legacy, in blood. And for royalty, built on all three, it was perfectly designed to destroy. Today, we view syphilis differently, a disease of the past, treatable, contained, rare even. But its impact lingers, not just in medical textbooks, but in the architecture of Europe, the order of history, and the stories we tell about the fall of the mighty. Those who wore crowns also wore scars, and though they may not speak of them, though their portraits remain serene, we now know what history did not dare admit aloud, that beneath the silks and swords, many of them itched, bled wept, and died slowly. The echo of footsteps through Versailles is quieter now, reduced to museum tours and audio guides. The imperial chambers of Schönbrunn stand spotless and sterile, each bed immaculately made, each velvet rope barring entry to rooms once rank with illness and incense. The palaces still gleam, but the kings are long gone, and so is the secret that for 4 centuries ruled with them, syphilis. Its royal chapter concludes not with an explosion but a slow, whispered fade. By the mid-20th century, a series of miracles, scientific, not spiritual, finally tamed the ancient disease. Penicillin, discovered in 1928 and deployed en masse during World War II, changed everything. For the first time, syphilis had a true enemy. One injection, and the parasite that haunted generations of monarchs was rendered powerless. But what it left behind was harder to treat. In royal families, the scars weren't only physical, they were genetic, psychological, and historical. The loss of heirs, the withering of lines, the decisions made in desperation, those consequences remained. Even in the post-antibiotic age, royal households continued to grapple with fragile inheritances and dynastic instability shaped not just by politics, but by centuries of intimate affliction. Take, for instance, the Windsors. By the time Queen Elizabeth II ascended the throne in 1952, the British monarchy had learned to retreat from scandal and embrace public decorum. But the lessons of syphilis still hovered in the margins. Heirs were closely monitored. Marriages vetted not only for class but for health. Medical records, once kept under layers of euphemism, now became part of the vetting process. The threat of inherited illness had been replaced by the anxiety of public scrutiny. Across the Channel, the Bourbons had all but vanished, reduced to titles without thrones. The remnants of the Habsburg and Romanov families scattered across Europe, often living in quiet exile or rebranded as museum curators and minor celebrities. Their diseases had gone with them, but so had their destinies, and the ghosts remained. In the 1980s, long after the last crowned head to suffer from syphilis had been buried, researchers began exhuming the hidden medical histories of monarchs. Autopsy reports, hidden correspondence, and cryptic medical notes were reanalyzed through the lens of modern diagnostics. The results were staggering. Historians began revisiting the lives of figures like Ivan the Terrible, Henry VIII, and Charles II of Spain with a new hypothesis: that their madness, sterility, or cruelty might have had less to do with divine punishment or bad temperament, and more to do with neurological decay from untreated infection. Neurologists studied the case of Friedrich Nietzsche, not royal but famously syphilitic, and mapped his hallucinations and breakdowns to later-stage neurosyphilis. Then, applying the same framework to rulers, they found eerie patterns: the erratic behaviour, the paranoia, the facial tics, the gait, the madness. Of course, proof remains elusive. Bodies were embalmed, records altered, diagnoses whispered behind closed doors, if spoken at all. But in the convergence of symptom and secrecy, the story clarifies. The disease did not kill kings quickly. It hollowed them over decades. It reduced warriors to weeping invalids. It made lovers afraid of touch. It turned princes into puppets, and queens into mourners. And in the process, it did what no army could. It ended the concept of invincible blood. More than that, syphilis altered diplomacy itself. The marriages arranged for power began to shift, slowly, subtly, toward genetic diversity. Cousin-marrying dynasties reconsidered their strategies. Some turned to minor nobles, others to foreign commoners. The idea of blood purity gave way, painfully, to blood viability. In the 20th century, as genetic science took root, it became clear just how disastrous centuries of inbreeding and disease concealment had been. Haemophilia, long thought a punishment from God, was revealed as a recessive inheritance. Infertility, once blamed on witches or wives, was traced to congenital conditions exacerbated by untreated STDs. And syphilis, its fingerprints showed up again and again in family medical histories, often disguised by euphemism: wasting fevers, phantom pain, melancholia, crimson patches. The disease had so effectively masked itself in culture and court language that by the time science caught up, its legacy was already embedded in the mythology of decline. But it wasn't just monarchies that changed. Society, having watched the downfall of those once thought immortal, began to question its own hierarchies. If kings could suffer like commoners, sweat, scream, bleed, then what made them kings? If crowns could not protect against infection, what could? The Enlightenment had started this erosion. Industrialization accelerated it. But the quiet work of microbes in royal bodies may have done just as much damage to the idea of divine right as any revolution ever did. It is telling that in modern constitutional monarchies, the emphasis is no longer on bloodline strength but on public relations. Royals survive not by conquest, but by health, by having good genes, by appearing wholesome and immune to scandal. They no longer rule, they perform wellness. And yet, even in this age of DNA tests and wellness blogs, the spectre of syphilis still haunts history's great houses. The questions linger. Did Catherine the Great's moods stem from infection? Did Maximilian of Mexico die of syphilis rather than a bullet? Was the madness of George III truly porphyria or mercury? Historians continue to debate. Geneticists continue to wonder. But in the end, perhaps the greatest legacy of syphilis isn't what it took, but what it exposed. It laid bare the human beneath the crown, the vulnerability beneath the power. It showed that kings and queens, despite their jewels and armies, had bodies just as fragile as the peasants outside their gates. That flesh rots, that minds decay, that even in the most perfumed halls, disease has no respect for rank. And so we close this long, winding journey through velvet and vinegar, through palaces and poisons, through bloodlines both blue and broken. From Charles VIII's fateful campaign in Naples, to the tragic madness of Don Carlos, the haunted gaze of Christian VII, the stiff-legged shuffle of Nicholas III, and the powder-faced decline of Louis XV, syphilis made itself at home among royalty, not as a guest, but as a permanent resident. It didn't just destroy individuals, it rewrote history. And today, as we walk through palace museums and study those smiling portraits, we do so with the knowledge that behind each powdered face might have been pain, behind each gilded cradle, loss, behind each succession crisis, the unspoken ripple of a long night, a quiet infection, and a secret buried with state honours. Syphilis did not wear a crown, but it broke many. So now, dear listener, the candles have burned low and the portraits stare silently from their gilded frames. The palaces are empty, the voices gone. But if you close your eyes and listen carefully, you might still hear the hush of silk, the creak of a sickbed, the whisper of a courtier leaning in with one more secret. Tonight, we've wandered through history's most opulent corridors, only to find that even among gold and power, there are shadows no crown can keep out. Syphilis, so small, so silent, changed more than we often admit. It was there in the quiet tragedies, the sudden deaths, the erratic rulers, the sealed autopsies. It rode alongside every coronation, hovered behind every royal affair, and lingered long after the ballrooms went still. Let that thought soothe you now, not to fear, but to reflect. Even those born into power are stitched from the same fabric as the rest of us. Skin, bone, breath, and all of it vulnerable, all of it human. So rest easy. The ghosts have shared their stories. The disease has faded into history, and tomorrow will come, free of crowns and curses. Let your breath slow. Let your muscles loosen. There are no monarchs to mourn tonight, only the hush of knowledge settling around you like a blanket.